There is a phrase that gets used a lot when people talk about this setting. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And that is true. But it skips something important, something that the writers and the lore keepers and the game designers have built into almost every layer of this universe. Hidden just beneath the surface of all that fire and blood and Baroque horror, the Chaos Gods are afraid. Not of you. Not of the armies of the Imperium. Not of any single weapon or warrior. What they are afraid of runs much deeper than that, and much stranger. The things that truly unsettle the ruinous powers are not the things that fight them. Some of the most terrifying threats to the Dark Gods have never swung a blade against a demon or fired a single shot into the warp. The things that genuinely threaten the existence of Khorne and Nurgle and Tzeentch and Slaanesh come from places those gods never expected, and from directions that their very nature makes it nearly impossible for them to fully understand or prepare against. This is the story of those threats, the things that even the mightiest, oldest, most terrible entities in the Warhammer universe lie awake, metaphorically, because gods do not sleep and worry about. The forces that could, given time and circumstance, do what no crusade and no great hero has ever managed. The forces that could end the Chaos Gods entirely. To understand what threatens them, though, you first have to understand what they actually are. Because the Chaos Gods are not gods in the conventional sense. They are not ancient, wise beings who created the universe and watch over it from some distant heaven. They are something far stranger and far more disturbing. And understanding the full depth of that strangeness is the key to understanding why certain things in the 40K setting are capable of making them genuinely, cosmologically afraid. Part 1. The nature of the ruinous powers. The Chaos Gods are not gods in the way that word gets used in most religions and mythologies. They are not benevolent creators who watch over their children. They are not ancient beings of incomprehensible wisdom who existed before time began. They are, at their most fundamental level, emotional resonances, echoes made flesh, the concentrated psychic weight of the feelings of every sentient being in the galaxy, given shape and consciousness and terrible, predatory hunger. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Every time a soldier raises a weapon in anger, a fragment of that anger seeps into the warp. Every time a dying plague victim prays for relief from their suffering, some trace of that despair flows into the Imperium. Every time a person indulges a hunger that cannot be filled, every time an ambitious schemer plots and plans and reaches for something just beyond their grasp, that energy crosses the boundary between the material universe and the psychic mirror realm that underlies it. In the warp, those fragments collect. They pool and eddy and swirl together around common themes, around particular emotional signatures, until the concentration grows dense enough to achieve something truly dangerous. Consciousness, will, purpose. Khorne is the oldest of the four main gods, formed from the very first moments that sentient beings began to kill each other out of rage, rather than simple survival necessity. He existed in protoform before humanity walked upright on Terra. His domain is blood and violence and martial pride, the savage joy of conquest, the red haze of battle fury that turns a person from a thinking creature into an instrument of destruction. He does not care who wins. He never has. Every skull taken, whether by his followers or by his enemies, feeds him. The more blood that flows across the galaxy, the stronger he becomes. He is described as sitting upon a great brass throne, surrounded by mountains of skulls, and those mountains grow higher every single day because the galaxy never stops making war. What is striking about Khorne, if you spend time really sitting with the lore, is how complete his domain is. He does not merely feed on followers who worship him. Every act of violence anywhere in the galaxy contributes to his power. Every war fought for justice or survival, or imperial expansion feeds him just as much as the bloodletting of his own berserker champions. He is fundamentally egalitarian in that specific, horrible way. The soldier dying with honor on the front line of a righteous defense against Daemon incursion is feeding Khorne with every kill, just as surely as the most devoted Khornate cultist screaming praise as they swing their chain axe. This is why military force alone can never truly defeat the Chaos Gods. Fighting them with war is like trying to put out a fire by throwing more fire at it. Tzeentch is the Lord of Change, the architect of fate, the great planner and schemer who embodies hope and ambition and the hunger for knowledge just as much as he embodies mutation and unpredictability. He is the god of every plan that has ever been laid, every hope ever held for a different tomorrow, every scheme that has wound through back channels and political courts and research labs and strategy rooms across the galaxy. He is the inevitable product of creatures that can imagine a future different from the present. And because sentient beings are, by their very nature, always imagining futures and plotting paths toward them, Tzeentch has never lacked for worshippers or power. He spins plans within plans within plans, a web of possibility so intricate that even he, by some accounts in the lore, cannot fully comprehend it. He changes constantly, a swirling figure of multicolored fire, because change is the only thing that never changes. The paradox of Tzeentch is that his plans always succeed and always fail simultaneously, because he arranges things so that any outcome advances some element of his schemes. If his followers win, that advances one plan. If they lose, that was the real plan all along, to create the conditions for something else 3 steps downstream. Some lore suggests that Tzeentch does not actually want any final victory, that he would be diminished by the achievement of any ultimate goal, because he is fundamentally the god of the pursuit, the endless reaching toward what has not yet been achieved. A Tzeentch who won would be a Tzeentch who had nothing left to plan for, and that absence of aspiration would hollow him out. Nurgle, the Plague Father, the Lord of Decay, was born from the fear of death. Every mortal creature that has ever existed has understood, on some level, that it will end, that the body will fail, that the warmth will fade, that consciousness will dissolve back into the universe from which it came. This awareness creates a specific kind of terror, a low, constant dread that permeates all sapient life. Nurgle is that dread given form. But he is also the acceptance of that dread, the perverse comfort that comes from surrendering to inevitability. His followers are, paradoxically, often the most cheerful beings in the galaxy, having made peace with decay in a way that others cannot. He is patient in a way that the other gods are not. He understands that everything ends. He is content to wait. There is something almost genuinely philosophical about Nurgle's nature, something that the lore explores in ways that are surprisingly thoughtful, given the context of an extremely baroque science fantasy war game. Nurgle does not celebrate death. He celebrates the cycle. The rotting tree feeds the fungus that feeds the creature, that fertilizes the soil that grows the next tree. Decay is not the opposite of life. It is life's continuation by other means. Nurgle's garden in the warp is a place of impossible fecundity, everything growing and rotting and growing again simultaneously. Life and death indistinguishable from each other, the boundary between them irrelevant. He is not evil in the way his brothers are evil. He is simply indifferent to suffering, in a way that makes his affection deeply, profoundly terrible. And Slaanesh, the youngest, and in some ways the most dangerous, was born from excess. From pleasure pushed past its limits into obsession, from the Aeldari civilization's 10,000-year descent into sensory indulgence so extreme that it tore a hole in reality and created a new god, made entirely of that civilization's darkest impulses. Slaanesh feeds on sensation and the pursuit of sensation, on desire and its satisfaction, and the hollow emptiness that immediately follows satisfaction, on perfection sought and cruelty inflicted as a form of art. Slaanesh is the youngest, but grows fastest, because in a universe full of intelligent beings, capable of experiencing pleasure and desire, there is no shortage of fuel. The birth of Slaanesh is one of the most cosmically significant events in the 40K timeline, and it is worth dwelling on. Around the 29th or 30th millennium, after a 10,000-year period of the Aeldari civilization's gradual collective descent into excess, the accumulated psychic resonance of that descent reached a critical mass. In the warp, the emotional signature of the Aeldari, already among the most psychically potent species in the galaxy by virtue of their ancient engineering by the Old Ones, achieved a kind of psychic criticality. The result was an explosion of new consciousness in the warp that consumed and destroyed most of the Aeldari civilization in a single moment. The Eye of Terror, that enormous warp rift that still dominates the spinward reaches of the galaxy in the 41st millennium, is the physical scar left by that birth. These four gods war with each other constantly in what is called the Great Game. The Imperium, the warp itself, is their battlefield. Vast territories of that impossible psychic dimension are controlled by one power or another, the borders shifting and churning as demonic legions fight for supremacy in ways that do not map cleanly onto any mortal understanding of warfare. When Nurgle's domain of the festering garden encroaches on what had been Siench's crystalline towers, armies of plague-bearers clash with horrors and flamers in conflicts that can last for what feels like centuries. When Khorne's brass fortresses advance against Slaanesh's palace of sensation, the violence feeds both of them, even as it tears their realms apart. No Chaos God can ever win this war. That is the essential, terrible truth at the heart of the Great Game. If any one of the four were to truly destroy the others, the emotional breadth that sustains them would be catastrophically reduced. A universe with only rage would be a universe without hope, without despair, without pleasure, and rage cannot feed upon itself indefinitely without the contrast of other emotions to give it definition. The gods need each other to exist. They are locked together in an eternal mutual dependence disguised as eternal mutual hatred. The Great Game is not a war with a possible ending. It is a permanent condition, unless something outside the system changes. And that is where the fear comes in. Because the Chaos Gods, for all their power, are deeply, profoundly dependent on things they do not control. They are, in the most literal and cosmological sense possible, parasites. They need mortal life. They need sentient beings experiencing strong emotions. They need the constant churn of the material universe, feeding psychic energy into the warp. The lore is explicit on this point. Remove the emotional fuel, and the gods weaken. Remove enough of it, and they would eventually dissolve back into the raw, unformed psychic energy of the warp, losing their consciousness and their will and their terrible hunger. And the galaxy, as it turns out, contains several things that could, under the right circumstances, starve them entirely, or worse. Please comment where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. That information somehow makes this whole thing feel more real. And if this is your first time here, and you want more deep dives into 40K lore like this one, subscribe. There is a lot more territory to cover. Part 2. The fundamental paradox strength built on a fragile foundation. Before examining each specific threat, it is worth sitting with the central weakness of the ruinous powers for a moment, because it illuminates everything else. The Chaos Gods are among the most powerful entities in this setting's cosmology. They are, by the standards of any reasonable measurement, effectively infinite. They exist outside normal time and space. They can reshape reality within their domains. They can grant gifts that violate the laws of physics. They have existed, in some form, for tens of millions of years, and they will likely exist for tens of millions more. And yet, they cannot exist without mortals. This is stated plainly in the lore. The Chaos Gods are created and sustained by the emotions and souls of every living being of the material universe. Remove the emotional fuel, and the gods weaken. Remove enough of it, and they would eventually dissolve back into the raw, unformed psychic energy of the warp, losing their consciousness and their will and their terrible hunger. The warp, before sentient life began filling it with concentrated emotional energy, was a calmer and in many ways more benign place. The early Old Ones, those ancient reptilian progenitors who seeded the galaxy with life and built the first roads through the Imperium, moved through a warp that was almost navigable, almost peaceful compared to the churning hell it would become. The war in heaven changed all of that, approximately 60 million years before the events of the 41st millennium. When the ancient Necrontyr made their terrible bargain with the Cetan star gods, surrendering their biological bodies for immortal frames of living metal in the process called biotransference, they gained an army capable of challenging the Old Ones. The war that followed was so catastrophic, so sustained, and involved such an enormous psychic toll in death and suffering across so many species that the warp itself was fundamentally altered. The calm, navigable Imperium became a storm. The older, more neutral warp entities that had existed within it were transformed into predators. New entities condensed out of the concentrated fear and rage and despair pouring in from billions of dying creatures across the galaxy. Khorne took shape from the blood of those ancient wars. Tzeentch coalesced from the desperate hope that the Old Ones and their creations poured into every stratagem and scheme. Nurgle grew fat on the despair of populations, watching their worlds die. These proto-gods were not yet the fully formed, fully conscious entities of the 41st millennium. They were more like weather patterns initially, emotional storms in the warp that had achieved a kind of semi-consciousness, a directional hunger, but the raw material was there. And as the eons continued, and the suffering continued, and the galaxy filled with more species, experiencing more extremes of emotion, those weather patterns solidified into something genuinely divine, in the most terrifying sense of that word. So the Chaos Gods are, at their origin, a wound, a scar, left by a war so terrible that it permanently poisoned the psychic underpinning of reality. They exist because mortals suffer and die and feel. As long as the galaxy contains sentient life engaged in the kinds of conflict and despair and ambition that characterize the 41st millennium, the gods will endure. But their existence has a specific, fragile architecture. They are not self-sustaining. They are not independent. They are, for all their cosmic scale and apparent omnipotence within their domains, dependent systems. They require input to function, and several forces in the 41st millennium threaten to disrupt or eliminate that input. The lore even acknowledges something striking about the nature of the great game that speaks to this fragility. When one of the four gods achieves a major victory over another, the victor does not grow proportionally stronger through simple addition. The defeated god's sphere of influence does not cleanly transfer. What actually happens is that the fabric of the warp becomes locally unstable in a way that is bad for all of them. The balance that allows all four to exist simultaneously is disrupted, which suggests that the system depends on a certain equilibrium, a certain distribution of emotional types, providing energy to each god roughly in proportion to their existing power, and any major disruption to that equilibrium threatens all of them. This is why Tzeentch, in the deepest and most paradoxical interpretation of his lore, may actually be working to prevent any final victory in the great game, including his own. A warp in which all four gods continue to exist in dynamic tension is a warp that is stable, that continues to function, that continues to feed. A warp in which one god destroys the others may achieve a Pyrrhic dominance that quickly collapses as the surviving god finds itself with insufficient variety of emotional input to maintain consciousness. The gods need each other, and they also need the mortals. And when either of those dependencies is threatened, the results are instructive. Part 3. The Silence of Soulless Things. How the Necrons Terrify the Warp. To understand why the Necrons disturb the Chaos Gods, you have to understand what the Chaos Gods experience when they look at the galaxy. Imagine standing in a field on a dark night and looking up at the stars. Each star is a source of light. Each one burns and glows and sends its warmth across the void. Now imagine that most of those stars are still there, still occupying the same positions, but the light is simply gone, not blocked, not dimmed, gone, as if it was never there. The stars are cold and dark and silent, and where they once made you feel small and warmed by the scale of existence, they now just feel like holes. That is approximately what the Necrons look like from the warp. 60 million years ago, the Necrontyr were a biological species. They burned bright in the Imperium. They felt and feared and loved and hated, and their psychic presence was visible from whatever passes for the perspective of warp entities. Their homeworld orbited an unstable star that bombarded them with lethal radiation, giving them short, painful lives, and that specific misery made them vivid in the psychic landscape. They were a species defined by resentment of their circumstances, by the awareness of mortality, by the bitterness of watching other species. The immortal Old Ones, above all others, live effortlessly, in ways that were forever denied to the Necrontyr. Then they transferred themselves into bodies of living metal. The C'tan offered biotransference as the ultimate solution to the Necrontyr condition, immortality through the abandonment of flesh. What they did not fully disclose was the cost. The transfer of consciousness from biological brain to living metal architecture stripped the Necrontyr of their souls in the process. The psychic aspect of their beings, the part that connected to the warp, that generated the emotional resonance that made them visible in the Imperium, was consumed by the C'tan during the process. It was the payment the star gods extracted, though they may not have framed it that way to their subjects. What emerged from biotransference were bodies of extraordinary capability and durability, but without the psychic warmth that had previously made the Necrontyr legible to the inhabitants of the warp. They were still intelligent. They could still think and plan and feel something that might be described as emotion in a reduced, distant sense, but they left no mark in the Imperium. They cast no psychic shadow. Their passage through the galaxy left no trail that warp entities could follow. The Necrons do not project into the Imperium. They leave no trail. They generate no emotional resonance that the warp can read. From the perspective of the Chaos Gods, an army of Necrons is essentially invisible. Worse than invisible, actually. Where a living army leaves a bright smear of emotional energy across the psychic landscape, an emotion-soaked trail of fear and fury, and the will to survive, a Necron force leaves something that might be described as a negative impression, a scooped-out hollow in the warp's fabric where something clearly exists and moves and acts, but produces nothing the warp can feed on. This is unsettling to the Chaos Gods for a reason that goes beyond simple frustration at not being able to corrupt Necron warriors. The Necrons are not a small faction. They are not a few thousand ancient warriors rattling around in tomb complexes scattered across a handful of systems. Their numbers are, by any estimate, staggering. The Necrontyr had conquered much of the galaxy 60 million years ago. Their tomb worlds dot virtually every corner of the Milky Way. Most estimates in the lore suggest that, when all the Necron dynasties are fully awake and operational, they will field armies so vast that even the Tyrannid hive fleets would need to take them seriously. A force on that scale, producing no psychic signature, moving through the galaxy like a silent tide with no emotional wake, represents a profound problem for entities whose power scales with the emotional output of the galaxy's inhabitants. There is something deeply eerie about the image of Necron tomb worlds waking up. These are planets that have been sealed and silent for 60 million years, their underground facilities maintaining the stasis fields that have preserved their occupants through the entirety of recorded history. Dynasties of billions, waiting with the patience that only immortal beings can muster, while the civilizations that rose and fell above them were entirely unaware that they were living on top of the sleeping dead. From the warp's perspective, these tomb worlds are voids, islands of absence in the psychic ocean of the galaxy, places where there is clearly something of substance, but nothing is alive in any way that matters to the Imperium. When a Necron tomb world activates, the experience from the warp's perspective is not the sudden appearance of life, but the sudden appearance of movement, of agency without psychic warmth. It is, for warp entities, a profoundly disorienting experience. But that is only the first part of why the Necrons worry the Dark Gods. The second part is their plan. The Silent King, Sarek, the last of the three rulers who oversaw the original biotransference and led the subsequent revolt against the C'tan, returned from his long self-imposed exile beyond the galaxy with a purpose. He had traveled into the intergalactic void. He had seen something out there in the dark between galaxies that convinced him the Necrons needed to wake up with urgency. That something was the Tyrannids, and we will come to them in a moment. But what matters here is Sarek's broader strategic goal for the Necrons once they have consolidated their civilization. The Silent King wants to end the warp's influence on the material universe, not reduce it, not contain it in specific locations, end it. Permanently sever the connection between the immaterium and real space across the entire galaxy, creating what earlier Necron civilization called tetrahedral zones of stable space, where the warp could not reach. The mechanism for achieving this is Blackstone, the material known in some sources as Noctilith, a substance with extraordinary anti-psychic properties that the ancient Necrons spent millions of years crafting into pylons and deploying across the galaxy. The Cadian pylons are the most famous surviving example of this network. Those black monolithic structures that dotted the surface of Cadia were not, as the Imperium assumed for thousands of years, some mysterious Xenos artifact of unknown purpose. They were components of an ancient Necron anti-warp defense grid built during the War in Heaven, specifically to create zones of stability where the increasingly chaotic Imperium could not penetrate. The fact that they sat right next to the Eye of Terror and kept that enormous warp rift partially contained for 10,000 years, gives you some sense of what even a damaged, partial, long-degraded deployment of this technology can accomplish. When the pylons were functioning at something approaching their intended capacity during the crisis at Cadia, Belisarius Cawl and the Necron Lord Trazyn the Infinite briefly activated the network to its maximum potential. In that moment, those pylons began to actually close the Eye of Terror, to physically compress that enormous wound in reality back toward healing. The Chaos Gods, observing what was happening, moved Abaddon to his most desperate act in a career spanning 10,000 years of military campaigns. He crashed an entire Blackstone fortress, a ship the size of a moon, directly into Cadia's surface to destroy the pylon network rather than allow it to operate. Think about that decision for a moment. Abaddon abandoned his military objectives, abandoned the strategic goals of the 13th Black Crusade, abandoned any notion of conventional victory to ensure those pylons did not survive. The Chaos Gods were more afraid of a functioning pylon network than they were interested in any military gain. That is a remarkable thing to understand about what the pylons represent. They are not just a battlefield obstacle. They are an existential threat to the warp's hold on reality. In the current timeline of 9th and 10th edition, the Silent King's Saracon dynasty is building the Pariah Nexus, the largest pylon network ever constructed in the modern era. An entire sector of space is being methodically cut off from the warp. The beings living there experience a creeping psychic numbness as the connection between their minds and the Imperium is slowly severed. It is deeply, profoundly unsettling to the humans and other species caught within it. The absence of the warp is not a neutral experience for beings who evolved with it, but, from the perspective of the Chaos Gods, the Pariah Nexus is a preview of what the universe could look like if Sarek succeeds in his grand project. There is a theological argument among scholars of the warp, the kind of argument that tends to get the person making it burned for heresy, regardless of which side they come down on, about whether cutting off the material universe from the warp would actually destroy the Chaos Gods or simply transform them into something more diminished. If the gods are sustained by the emotional output of the living universe, and that output is severed completely, would they die? Would they diminish to the point of irrelevance? Or would they find some other source of sustenance in the timeless void of the warp's deepest reaches? The fact that the Chaos Gods spend so much effort opposing the Necron Pylon project suggests they consider it a genuine threat to their existence. When the greatest manipulator in the galaxy, and the Lord of Rage, and the God of Entropy, and the Prince of Excess all consider something worth opposing with real urgency, that something is doing something right. Part 4. The Pharaoh's Weapon, Blackstone, and the War on the Warp itself. The Necron plan goes deeper than pylons alone, and understanding the full scope of it requires understanding what Blackstone actually is and what it does on a fundamental level. The 40K lore describes Blackstone as a material capable of absorbing, redirecting, or negating psychic energy. But that simple description does not convey how radical a material this actually is. In a universe where the warp permeates everything, where psychic energy is as fundamental to physical reality as gravity or electromagnetism, the warp does not just run parallel to the material universe, it underlies it. Every point in real space has a corresponding point in the immaterium. Every living being with a soul exists simultaneously in both places, their physical body in one and their psychic reflection in the other. The boundary between the two realms is not a wall, but a membrane, permeable under specific conditions. This is why demons can be summoned, why psychic powers work, why the Chaos Gods can project influence into the material realm at all. The membrane leaks, constantly, in both directions. Psychic energy bleeds into real space as raw, warp storms and minor demonic manifestations, and the haunted quality of battlefields where many have died in anguish. And material existence bleeds into the warp as the emotional residue that feeds the gods and fuels the great game. Blackstone disrupts this process at its most fundamental level. When shaped correctly and deployed at sufficient density and in the right geometric patterns, it does not just block individual psychic effects, it changes the local relationship between the two realms entirely. It does not seal the membrane so much as it removes the membrane entirely from a given area, creating a zone where the two realms are simply not in correspondence with each other. The warp still exists, somewhere, but it has no anchor point in that area of real space. It cannot reach in. The gods cannot see that zone. Their demons cannot manifest there. Their influence cannot corrupt the material within those boundaries. In the War in Heaven, the ancient Necrons built these zones strategically. They needed places where their soulless legions could stage and plan and maintain their equipment without interference from the increasingly chaotic warp that was simultaneously being poisoned by the fallout of the war. They were fighting. The Old Ones, who relied on the warp for travel and communication and power, had initially dominated the conflict because of their psychic advantages. The Blackstone zones denied them those advantages in critical areas and gave the Necrons regions of the galaxy where the Cetan and their living metal warriors could operate without the psychic hazards that plagued other species. The history of Blackstone itself is fascinating and mostly beyond mortal knowledge, even in the 41st millennium. Some lore suggests that the Necrons did not entirely create Blackstone so much as discover it and learn to shape and concentrate its properties. The universe contains other examples of naturally occurring materials with anti-psychic properties, but Blackstone is special in the scale and specificity of its effect. It is not simply a psychic dampener in the way that certain ores can reduce or redirect psychic effects. It is something more targeted than that, more architecturally precise. The difference between a sponge and a dam. The Necrons collected Blackstone aggressively before their long sleep, working it into obelisks and pylons across the galaxy in preparation for the stasis that would last 60 million years. Many of these installations were destroyed or degraded over the millennia. The galaxy is not a static place, and 60 million years of geological activity, civilizational rises and falls, wars, and cataclysms have reduced most of the ancient network to isolated remnants. But the remnants that survived were, as the Cadian example shows, still capable of extraordinary effect. Now the Silent King has demonstrated something that changes the strategic picture entirely. The Saracon dynasty can produce new Blackstone, not just use surviving ancient examples, but manufacture the material from the constituent elements that the Necrons still understand after 60 million years of technological preservation. The Pariah Nexus uses pylons that were not ancient relics, but newly constructed devices built to modern Necron specifications, deployed in the patterns that Necron mathematical understanding indicates will produce maximum warp suppression effect. If the production of Blackstone can be scaled, if the Necrons can build pylons faster than the forces of chaos can destroy them, the eventual result is a galaxy increasingly cut off from the Imperium. Not all at once, and probably not in any mortal's lifetime, and possibly not even in a Necron's very long lifetime. But the direction of change is clear. The pylon network grows, the silent zones expand, and the Chaos Gods watch their access to the emotional fuel of the galaxy narrow, slowly but inexorably, like a hand tightening around something they cannot afford to lose. There is a counter-argument that the lore acknowledges. Blackstone is apparently quite rare, and the global supply is limited. Even with the Saracon dynasty's manufacturing capability, the amount of Blackstone that would be needed to extend the Pariah Nexus to galactic scale is almost incomprehensible. The galaxy is vast in ways that dwarf even ancient, spacefaring civilizations' ability to easily engineer at scale. A pylon network covering the entire Milky Way would require resources that even the most powerful Necron dynasty might not be able to assemble. But progress does not require perfection. A galaxy where significant fractions of inhabited space are cut off from the warp is a galaxy where the Chaos Gods are meaningfully weaker. A galaxy where the Cadian Gate equivalent exists around every major Imperial population center, where the great warp rifts are contained behind Blackstone walls, where demonic incursions are limited to regions the Necrons have not yet gotten around to, is a galaxy where chaos is declining, slowly. But the Chaos Gods exist on geological timescales, and slow but consistent progress in the wrong direction eventually reaches the same place as fast progress. The Chaos Gods cannot easily destroy the pylon networks through daemonic means. The forces of chaos are defined by their warp connection, and Blackstone actively resists warp influence. Sending daemonic armies into a fully activated pylon zone would be like trying to fill a container that is actively rejecting its contents. The daemons would dissolve, their warp stuff leaking away faster than they could maintain cohesion in that environment. The only effective way to destroy a pylon network is with weapons of the material realm, physical force applied by beings of flesh or metal, or anything that operates outside the warp's influence. This is precisely why Abaddon and the forces of the Black Legion prioritize attacking Necron pylon installations when they encounter them. Every time a Chaos Warband attacks a Necron tomb complex where pylons are being constructed, every time Black Legion strike forces target Blackstone deposits before they can be extracted and shaped, it is not merely a raid for resources or glory. It is a strategic necessity recognized at the highest level of Chaos military planning, a critical operation in the great game being played at scales that most mortal participants in those battles cannot fully appreciate. Part 5. The Hive that Dreams of Silence, the Tyrannid Threat to Chaos. If the Necrons are the threat that the Chaos gods can identify and oppose through military and strategic means, even if those means are difficult and indirect, the Tyrannids are something altogether more unsettling. The Tyrannids are not trying to harm the Chaos gods. They do not care about the Chaos gods. They do not know about the Chaos gods in any meaningful sense. They are simply hungry, and if their hunger is not stopped, the result would be the extinction of the Chaos gods through simple starvation. The Tyrannids arrived in the Milky Way galaxy from intergalactic space, which means they came from beyond the galaxy's boundaries, from the void between galaxies, where there are no stars and no life, and no psychic warmth of any kind. They are not from a rival galaxy in the way that science fiction usually imagines alien invaders. They appear to have consumed multiple nearby galaxies before reaching ours, leaving behind husks of stellar matter stripped entirely clean of biological life. Their method is consistent across every system they have touched. Scouting organisms arrive first, often via corrupted vessels carrying genstealer lodges that begin preparing a target world's population psychically and militarily for the invasion to come. These scouts establish contact with the hive mind and begin the process of marking a world for consumption. Then the hive fleets arrive, and the hive fleets are, by any measure, among the most overwhelming forces in the setting's history. They do not arrive in small advance guards that can be fought back. They arrive as walls of biological starships stretching across the sky of their target systems, millions of organisms ranging from the smallest mode of living chitin to the impossibly vast hive ships that dwarf most space stations. They strip every source of biomass from every world they touch, breaking down every organic molecule into a nutrient slurry that is reabsorbed into the fleet, processed, and used to grow more Tyrannids and more weapons and more organisms, adapted to the specific challenges encountered on that world. The Tyrannid approach to evolution and adaptation is one of the most genuinely alien things in the setting. Where other species develop through the slow process of natural selection or through deliberate technological development, the Tyrannids can adapt in real time. When a hive fleet encounters a new type of enemy or defense, the hive mind analyzes the challenge and produces new organism types, new morphologies, new weapons, new tactics, all generated by the hive mind's incomprehensible processing power and then manufactured in the living factories of the hive ships. What destroyed one Tyrannid wave of attack is neutralized by the next. The Great Devourer does not make the same tactical mistake twice. There is no negotiation with the Tyrannids. There is no appealing to their interests. There is no corrupting them, because corruption requires a mind to corrupt, and the Tyrannid hive mind is so alien that the Chaos gods have no meaningful purchase on it. The lore is quite specific about this. When Tyrannid forces clash with demonic legions, neither side gains from the other. The Tyrannids do not absorb Daemon's warp stuff as biomass, because Daemon flesh provides nothing the hive mind can use. Warp energy is not organic matter. It has no caloric value in the Tyrannid metabolic sense. And the Daemons cannot corrupt the Tyrannids because the hive mind's alien consciousness provides no point of access for the whispered temptations and psychic manipulations that Chaos uses against other species. The two forces simply fight through each other, treating the clash as an obstacle to their respective goals, neither able to really harm the other in any fundamental strategic sense, both racing to consume the organic material of the galaxy that only one of them can actually use. The psychic phenomenon called the shadow in the warp is critical to understanding why the Chaos Gods find the Tyranids so profoundly threatening at a level beyond simple military power. The hive mind is an entity of staggering psychic complexity. The chief librarian, Tigurius of the Ultramarines, one of the most powerful human psychers alive, looked directly into the hive mind once and barely retained his sanity afterward. The hive mind is so complex, so massive, so completely alien in its structure, that it simply overwhelms the psychic perception of most beings who attempt to interface with it. But the shadow in the warp is not just the impressive scale of the hive mind itself. It describes what the hive mind does to the psychic landscape around a hive fleet as it approaches. As a hive fleet draws near, its psychic presence, the combined psychic output of billions upon billions of organisms linked into a single consciousness, creates a zone of psychic interference that extends across light years of space. Within the shadow in the warp, interstellar communications break down. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon maintained by the Emperor that allows navigators to guide ships through the warp, becomes unreliable or invisible. Individual psychers within the shadow experience their connection to the warp as something pressing against them from outside, something vast and cold and utterly indifferent, like standing in the ocean at night and feeling a current that might be an enormous thing moving just below the surface of your awareness. The shadow in the warp does not just disrupt communication and navigation, it suppresses the local expression of warp energy. The Chaos Gods cannot see clearly through it. Their daemonic servants cannot manifest easily within it. The psychic resonance that normally allows chaos corruption to build over time in an area, that gradual contamination of the air and earth, and people's dreams that precedes a full daemonic incursion, is drowned out by the alien psychic noise of the approaching hive mind. In areas under the shadow of a major hive fleet, chaos finds itself unable to operate effectively. Its prayers go unanswered. Its corruption stalls. The very medium through which the ruinous powers project their influence has been filled with something else entirely, something that does not recognize them and does not care about them, and is consuming the very substrate they need to exist. And that is before considering what happens to the emotional fuel supply when a hive fleet is done with a world. After a Tyranid assault has been completed, after the biomorphs and warriors and digestive organisms have processed every gram of organic matter on a world's surface, what remains is called a dead world in the context of the Tyranid advance. Stone and metal and the processed debris of stripped ecosystems. No soil microbes, no insects, no plant matter, nothing that generates psychic energy, because nothing living remains. The warp above such worlds is described in the lore as a howling emptiness, a silence where there was previously a chorus of millions of individual psychic presences. Even the lore's most hardened characters, people who deal with the horror of chaos as a daily professional reality, find the silence of a stripped world disturbing in a different way than the noise of chaos corruption. Now extend that process to a galactic scale. The Tyranids have, according to the lore, consumed multiple galaxies already. The direction of approach of different hive fleets suggests they have been ranging through a significant portion of the local galaxy group, consuming world after world, galaxy after galaxy. If they succeed in consuming the Milky Way, the result is a galaxy where every source of psychic energy, every living being that feeds the Chaos Gods, every soul that fuels the Great Game, has been consumed by organisms that generate no lasting warp presence of their own and give back nothing meaningful to the Imperium. The galaxy goes psychically silent. And in that silence, the gods of chaos, sustained by nothing, dependent on the emotional output of a galaxy that no longer exists in any meaningful biological sense, would simply fade. The lore acknowledges that the Chaos Gods, when they recognize the Tyranid threat clearly enough to cooperate, actually do cooperate against it. Warbands of different chaos allegiances have been noted fighting alongside each other against Tyranid incursions, the temporary alliances that the gods broker when something threatens their shared interests. Because the Tyranids do not offer the Chaos Gods corruption opportunities or souls to collect or emotional extremes to feed on, they offer only consumption, followed by silence. There is a layer of cruel irony here that the lore allows you to see if you look for it. The Chaos Gods themselves, through millennia of manipulation and war and corruption, have helped to generate the emotional extremes that make the Milky Way such a rich target. The wars fueled by chaos corruption, the suffering and terror and desperation of populations fighting demonic incursions, the psychic screams of worlds dying to demonic assault, these do not feed the hive mind directly, but they create a psychic resonance, a brightness in the galaxy's psychic signature that makes the Milky Way more visible across the intergalactic void. The intensity of psychic suffering that chaos generates is partly what drew the Tyranids here in the first place. In spreading misery and conflict, the Chaos Gods may have inadvertently advertised the galaxy's richness to the one force in the universe that could consume everything they depend on. The Chaos Gods helped send out the invitations to their own potential extinction. Part 6. The God that eats gods in need, and the Aeldari prophecy. If the Necrons threaten the Chaos Gods through material means, and the Tyranids threaten them through a kind of cosmic gluttony that would leave nothing for anyone, Enid represents something altogether more targeted, and in some ways more personal. Enid is not a side effect of something else. It is not an alien threat from outside the system. It is a god being specifically, intentionally grown within the warp itself, specifically to destroy another god. And the god it is meant to destroy, Slaanesh, the youngest and most recent of the 4 main Chaos Gods, is, by all available lore evidence, genuinely afraid of what is forming in the infinity circuits of the craft worlds. To understand Iniad, you need to understand what happened to the Aeldari gods. The Aeldari, that ancient race of long-lived and supremely psychic beings, once had a rich and elaborate pantheon. Their gods were powerful beings of the warp, born from the accumulated faith and psychic output of a civilization that had existed for millions of years. Cain, the god of war, ancient and terrible, whose martial dominion predated even the oldest human memory. Isha, the goddess of fertility and healing, gentle and life-giving. The mother figure of the Aeldari myth cycle, Segurak, the laughing god, trickster and survivor, the clown face on the mask of cosmic horror. Kurnus, the god of the hunt. Vol, the artificer, the smith. Morai Heg, the crone goddess of fate and destiny. Dozens of others. A rich and ancient pantheon that defined and sustained Aeldari culture for uncountable generations. When Slaanesh was born from the Aeldari civilization's millennia-long collective descent into excess and hedonism so extreme that it tore reality apart, the new Chaos God did not merely emerge, it consumed. The birth of Slaanesh was, from the Aeldari god's perspective, a predatory psychic event of incomprehensible violence. The young god burst into being in the warp and immediately devoured the Aeldari pantheon, consuming gods that had existed for millions of years in what felt from outside like almost no time at all. Even Cain, the god of war himself, was shattered by the force of Slaanesh's birth, his divine essence splintering across the galaxy into hundreds of fragments that became the avatars of Cain worshipped by craftworld Aeldari to this day. Only 3 gods escaped. Segurach, the laughing god, survived by being exactly what he is, a trickster and dancer who lives in the webway and moves too fast and too unpredictably to be caught even by a newborn deity consuming everything in its reach. There is something deeply characteristic about the laughing god's survival method. He did not fight. He did not try to resist. He simply was not there when the killing blow landed. Segurach still exists in the 41st millennium, still laughing, still moving through the webway in the shadow of the greater tragedy, patron of the Harlequins who keep Aeldari history and myth alive in the only form that cannot be destroyed: performance. Isha, the goddess of life and healing, was consumed by Slaanesh, but before she could be devoured fully, Nurgle intervened. The Plague Father, that paradoxical deity of decay and twisted affection, rescued Isha from Slaanesh, which might seem like salvation until you understand what Nurgle's idea of care entails. Isha is imprisoned in Nurgle's garden, his most prized captive, endlessly subjected to the new diseases he creates. He feeds her his latest plagues like a child, showing a parent their artwork. She whispers the cures for those diseases to mortals in the material universe when Nurgle's back is turned, which is perhaps the most quietly heroic thing any divine being in the setting does. She is a prisoner, but she uses her captivity to reduce suffering wherever she can. And Cain, shattered, distributes his divine warrior spirit across hundreds of avatar statues waiting in the depths of Craftworld shrines, each one a fragment of what was once a complete god. What this means for the surviving Eldari is a perpetual crisis that defines every aspect of their civilization and every decision they make. Every Eldari who dies without having their soul safely stored in a spirit stone, a psychic vessel worn during life, and surrendered to the Craftworld's infinity circuit at death, is immediately consumed by Slaanesh. The chaos god of pleasure has a particular hunger for Eldari souls, which carry an unusual richness and potency compared to human souls, a legacy of the Eldari's ancient psychic engineering. For the Craftworld Eldari, every moment of every life is shadowed by the knowledge that death without proper preparation means eternal consumption by the being that destroyed their civilization and devoured their gods. They call Slaanesh she who thirsts, and the hunger of that title is not metaphorical. Into this nightmare, a prophecy. Hidden in the dreams of Eldari seers and the winding mythology of those who would become the Ynnari, there is a prediction. In the infinity circuits of the Craftworlds, those vast psychic repositories where the souls of dead Eldari are stored in relative safety generation after generation, a god is forming. This is not a god that was always there and is now awakening. This is a god being built from the accumulated dead, soul by soul, generation by generation, over the 10,000 years since the fall. This is Ynnid, the whispering god, the death god yet to be. The theory behind Ynnid is elegant and terrible in equal measure. If every Eldari who has ever died contributes their soul's essence to the infinity circuit, rather than being consumed by Slaanesh, and if enough Eldari die over enough time, the accumulated psychic mass of all those stored souls will eventually coalesce into a being of sufficient power to challenge Slaanesh directly. A god of death and release who will take Slaanesh's power away, who will destroy she who thirsts and end the curse that has hung over the Eldari for 10,000 years. This prophecy has a complication that speaks to the particular darkness of the Eldari tradition. The original version said that Ynnid would form fully when the last Eldari died, contributing the final soul needed to tip the balance. Which means the old prophecy essentially required the complete extinction of the Eldari for their god to be born. There is something almost unbearably sad about that. A people so broken by their history that the most hopeful scenario they could imagine for their salvation required that none of them survive to see it. More recent lore has developed a different path, which may represent a genuine shift in the metaphysics, or may represent the Eldari's desperate hope overriding the more brutal math of the original prophecy. In events culminating in the Battle of Port Demesnes, around the close of the 41st millennium, an Eldari ritual that was interrupted but not entirely prevented resulted in Ynnid awakening partially, reaching into the material universe through a champion named Yvrain and manifesting a physical avatar called the Yincarne, the avatar of Ynnid. Ynnid is not yet fully formed. The god is not yet strong enough to directly challenge Slaanesh. But the partial awakening was enough to give Slaanesh a moment of real alarm, from a deity that virtually never experiences anything resembling genuine vulnerability. The lore's description of how the other Chaos gods reacted to this event is instructive. Khorne and Tzeentch and Nurgle did not celebrate Slaanesh's discomfort. They reacted with their own concern. Not the same level of existential dread that Slaanesh felt, because a god formed specifically to kill Slaanesh is more immediately threatening to Slaanesh than to the others. But there is a broader concern that all four of them share. Ynnid's very existence suggests something that the Chaos gods find philosophically uncomfortable, that the warp is not their exclusive domain, that other sources of psychic power can generate divinity that does not serve them, does not feed the great game, does not play by their rules, and is powerful enough to potentially destroy one of the four fundamental pillars of the great game. If Slaanesh were destroyed by Ynnid, the balance of the great game would be fundamentally altered. 3 gods, not 4. The emotional territory that Slaanesh currently covers, all the excess and desire and sensation and cruelty and aesthetic obsession, would presumably be redistributed somehow, or perhaps simply lost from the system. And a great game with 3 players, with the balance disrupted by the loss of one of its foundational elements, might not be sustainable in its current form. The Eldari prophecy, called the Rana Dandra, describes a final battle in which the Eldari, unified across all their factions, march against the combined forces of chaos. The Phoenix Lords lead. Every Eldari warrior alive joins them. The battle destroys both sides, both realities, both the material universe and the Imperium, and out of that destruction, the fully awakened Yinid delivers the death blow to Slaanesh that ends the curse forever. Whether or not this unfolds as prophesied, whether the Ranadandra is an accurate prediction or an inspiring myth, Yinid's partial existence is already a problem for chaos. A god that grows stronger as Slaanesh pursues the war against the Eldari. A god that feeds on Eldari deaths rather than on emotions that chaos controls. A god that is, by its fundamental nature, the opposite of Slaanesh's hunger. Part 7. The Anathema. The Emperor and his eternal war against the Dark Gods. The Chaos Gods call the Emperor of mankind the Anathema. This is not a casual insult, and not simply a label for an enemy. The word carries theological weight in the cosmology of the warp. Anathema, in the religious sense that the Dark Gods almost certainly intend, means something formally cursed, something cast out, something that is specifically and fundamentally opposed to the nature of the thing using the term. The Emperor is anathema to chaos, in a way that goes beyond him simply being an opponent. He represents something that should not be possible by the rules under which the Chaos Gods operate. Consider what the Emperor is at his most fundamental level. He was born from the simultaneous sacrifice of 10,000 shamans on ancient Terra, approximately 8,000 years before the common era of the current millennium. These shamans, who had developed the ability to see the warp and understand its dangers in the earliest centuries of human psychic development, collectively sacrificed themselves so that their souls could combine and reincarnate in a single being. Their goal was to create a guardian for humanity's nascent psychic nature, a being powerful enough to protect the species from the predators of the Imperium in the long millennia before humanity developed the tools and understanding to protect itself. The resulting being was the Emperor. Born as a child in ancient Anatolia, he grew into a consciousness of staggering scope and power. He was a perpetual, one of the rare humans who cannot die permanently and who are reborn when killed. Though the Emperor was the most extreme example of this category. Each death and rebirth hardened him, refined him, made his psychic presence in the warp more dangerous to the entities that dwell there. He lived through the entirety of recorded human history, under various names and guises, watching civilizations rise and fall, learning, accumulating, waiting for the moment when he could act at the scale his nature demanded. The Chaos Gods were aware of him long before he revealed himself. He was too bright in the psychic landscape to be missed, but they could not easily corrupt him, could not tempt him, could not find the emotional leverage that allows them to gain purchase in a mind. He was not invulnerable to suffering. He had watched his people die for millennia, but he processed suffering differently from ordinary mortals, with a perspective so broad and deep that the whispered promises of the Dark Gods offered him nothing he did not already see through, nothing he considered worth the price. By the time of the Great Crusade, when the Emperor reunited humanity under the banner of the Imperium and sent his Primarchs and their Space Marine legions to bring every human world into a single polity, the Dark Gods could see the scale of the threat he represented clearly. Not just the military threat of an organized Imperium, not just the ideological threat of the imperial truth, which was explicitly atheistic and sought to deny the gods' worship by denying their existence to billions of humans who might otherwise have given them devotion. The deeper threat was structural and long-term. The Emperor was trying to do something that the Chaos Gods found fundamentally offensive to their nature. He was trying to make the galaxy orderly. He was trying to reduce the suffering and chaos that fed the warp. He was building a Mekboy extension that would have allowed humanity to travel between stars without using the warp at all, cutting chaos off from the psychic exposure it gets every time a human ship rides the tides of the Imperium. He was planning to manage and guide the development of human psychers so that they would not be vulnerable to demonic possession, a project that, if successful, would have eventually produced a human species far less accessible to chaos influence than the current one. He was, in the broadest sense, attempting to engineer a future in which the Chaos Gods would be increasingly marginalized, their power base among humanity systematically reduced generation by generation. The Chaos Gods suborned Horus. That intervention, that careful, patient corruption of the Emperor's greatest son, the War Master who commanded his armies, was the Dark Gods' most successful single operation in their recorded history. They needed to stop what the Emperor was building before it was complete. They needed to create a crisis that would force him off his current trajectory, something so overwhelming that it would derail the Webway project and the Psyker management program and all the other long-term structural threats. They succeeded in that specific goal. Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Sons, in attempting to warn his father of Horus's corruption through a psychic sending, shattered the wards around the Emperor's Webway portal and allowed a tide of demons to pour through the breach. The Emperor abandoned his grand plan and took up his vigil at the Golden Throne, using his own psychic power to hold back the demonic incursion that now threatened to consume Terra from within. The heresy followed. Half the Primarchs defected, worlds burned, Cadia was established, the Eye of Terror was abandoned to the traitor legions, and in the final battle at the Siege of Terra, the Emperor was broken, mortally wounded by Horus in a confrontation of such psychic and physical scale that it left scars in the warp visible from across the galaxy. His surviving servants placed him on the Golden Throne, and there he has remained for over 10,000 years. From the Golden Throne, the Emperor sustains the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that allows navigators to guide ships through the warp across vast interstellar distances. Without it, the Imperium would fragment within generations, unable to coordinate across thousands of light years. He maintains the Imperium's fundamental coherence through his continued existence, and he fights, constantly, without pause. Every moment of every standard year since the heresy, the mind of the Emperor is locked in a war against the warp itself, pushing back against the tide of chaos that presses against the reality of the Imperium, preventing demonic incursions that would otherwise overwhelm planets constantly, holding the membrane between real space and immaterium intact in ways that would otherwise require the active efforts of armies of Psykers just to replicate. 1,000 Psykers are sacrificed to sustain him every day. Brought to Terra from across the Imperium, their life forces consumed to fuel the Golden Throne and maintain the Emperor's psychic operations. It is, by any honest accounting, one of the most horrible ongoing processes in the setting, a practice that the Imperium has maintained for over 10,000 years, because the alternative is the Emperor's death, and the collapse of the Astronomicon and the psychic war he fights, being instantly and catastrophically lost. The Chaos Gods are sustained by the fact that the Emperor's condition is deteriorating. The Golden Throne is ancient technology, maintained by generation after generation of tech priests who increasingly do not fully understand it. The Emperor's physical form continues to crumble. There are theories about what he is becoming, dark and contested and fascinating, theories that suggest the accumulated millennia of sacrifice and worship and the psychic resonance of 1 trillion humans praying to him as a god are changing what he is, making him something new, something the galaxy has not seen before. The Star Child theory holds that the Emperor's soul has been slowly gestating in the warp throughout his time on the Golden Throne, growing toward a new birth as something that was not a man, but was not quite like any warp entity that previously existed. A god of humanity formed from the concentrated faith of his people, rather than from their suffering. A being of pure order that would be to the Chaos Gods what Yniad is prophesied to be to Slaanesh, not just an opponent, but a fundamental cancellation of their power. Whether that is true or will ever come to pass, the current Emperor presents a specific, ongoing problem for Chaos. He is too strange to corrupt. He is too diffuse after 10,000 years to pin down and fight. And his mere existence gives humanity a focal point that generates hope and faith and devotion of a type that does not feed the Dark Gods. Part 8. The Renegade Malice and the Horror of Chaos Turning Against Itself. There are 4 Chaos Gods, but there is, in the shadowed corners of the lore, a 5th. Or the remnant of a 5th. Or the concept of a 5th. Persistent enough that even Games Workshop's various attempts to retire it have not managed to fully erase its presence. Malal, known in the 40K context as Malice, the renegade god, the outcast, the hierarch of anarchy and terror. Malice is what happens when chaos turns against itself completely, not the tactical infighting of the great game, where the gods scheme and war against each other while remaining fundamentally part of the same self-sustaining system, not the constant betrayal and counter-betrayal that characterizes the politics of the warp. Something more radical. The embodiment of chaos's own internal self-destructive tendency, given consciousness and will, and turned with absolute specificity against the other gods. The mythology of Malal, from the oldest Warhammer texts, describes the moment of his turning with unusual imagery. It says that at some point in the deep past, Malal turned his heart against the other gods and fled into the chambers of space, taking with him the concept that chaos itself is the most perfect expression of disorder, a disorder that cannot even be loyal to its own nature. The other gods, the text says, grew fearful, not of being defeated, not of being attacked, but of the concept that malice represented. That chaos, pushed far enough, destroys itself. That the principle of anarchy, followed to its logical conclusion, exempts nothing from destruction, not even the gods of anarchy. The key to Malice's specific threat is in his power source. He feeds parasitically on the other chaos gods. As they grow powerful, as the great game intensifies and the gods of chaos become stronger, Malice draws from that power like a leech on a vein. He cannot grow independently. He cannot generate his own base of worship easily, because the truly committed servants of Malice are so committed to destroying chaos that they eliminate potential recruits as readily as they eliminate enemies of chaos. But he grows steadily as long as the other gods grow, which means the more powerful the great game becomes, the more powerful the renegade god becomes by reflection. Malice's followers, the Doomed Ones, most notably represented by the Sons of Malice Space Marine chapter in the 40K lore, are a specific kind of terrifying. They fight against chaos with the fanaticism that other chaos followers bring to fighting against the Imperium. They destroy demonic entities and chaos champions and chaos facilities with the same fervor and skill that cornate berserkers destroy skulls. They do not do this in the Emperor's name. They do not do it for the Imperium. They do not do it for any conventional notion of righteousness. They do it because Malice demands the destruction of chaos itself. And in that mandate they find a clarity of purpose that is, in its own way, as pure as any expression of faith in the 41st millennium. The other chaos gods hate and fear Malice in a way that is qualitatively different from how they hate and fear each other. When Khorne and Tzeentch war against each other, there is mutual investment in the conflict. The great game requires opponents. But Malice does not want to win the great game. Malice wants to end the great game. Its victory condition is one that would destroy all the participants, including itself. And for entities defined by the drive to accumulate power and influence and worshippers, an opponent who wants everything to be destroyed, including itself, represents a conceptual problem for which their nature provides no obvious solution. The fact that Malice is not a major canonical figure in current 40K does not eliminate what the concept represents. Even diminished, even semi-canonical, Malice serves as a reminder that the chaos gods are not immune to the force they embody. They are chaos. And chaos, by its fundamental nature, contains within it the logic of self-destruction. Nurgle embodies decay. Tzeentch embodies perpetual change that never settles. Khorne embodies violence, with no discrimination between friend and foe. Slaanesh embodies desire that cannot be satisfied and eventually destroys its host. The seeds of ending are present in the nature of each god. Malice is what happens when those seeds are given their own consciousness and pointed back at the source. Part 9. The green tide that cannot be corrupted. Orks and the Chaos Gods. Particular frustration. The Orks occupy a unique position in the hierarchy of threats to chaos. They are not trying to threaten the ruinous powers, and their existence does not pose an existential danger to the gods in the way that the Necron Pylon plan or the Tyrannid Hunger does. But they represent something that the Chaos Gods fundamentally cannot exploit. For entities whose primary means of influence is corruption, an entire species that is completely immune to their corruption represents a category of problem that does not have a satisfying solution. The Orks were engineered. Like the Aeldari, they were created by the Old Ones in the final desperate phase of the war in heaven, when the C'tan and Necrons were grinding down the Old Ones' defenses, and the ancient reptilian progenitors needed fighters who could operate without the psychic advantages that the Old Ones themselves possessed. The Krork, the ancient precursor form of what became the modern orc, were specifically designed to be extremely effective soldiers who did not rely on warp-based psychic power and could therefore operate in zones where the Citan's material dominance neutralized psychic advantages. The Old Ones built a specific limitation into their creation. They blocked orc access to the warp as individual psychers would access it. An orc weirdboy, the closest thing the orcs have to a conventional psyker, does not draw power directly from the Imperium. Instead, the weirdboy acts as a focus and conduit for the collective psychic energy generated by nearby orcs, a fundamentally different mechanism than conventional psyker power. The massive green tide generates its own psychic field, a gestalt force called by the same name as their collective battle cry, and that energy operates on different principles from warp energy. It is not drawn from the same source that feeds the chaos gods. It does not create the same kind of access points that other forms of psychic power create. It is a closed loop, orc psychic energy, generated by orcs and consumed by orcs, and benefiting no entity outside the orc ecosystem. The practical result of this architecture is that orcs cannot be corrupted by chaos the way other species can. The chaos gods cannot offer an orc vision of ecstasy and promise to make that ecstasy permanent, because an orc's idea of ecstasy is just a better fight, and an orc can find a better fight on his own without supernatural assistance. They cannot whisper to an orc of power beyond what he already possesses and receive the desperate, hungry response that would allow them to gain a foothold in that orc's psyche. The fundamental drive of an orc is to fight, to win, to find a bigger fight and win that one too. This drive is so pure and so deeply embedded in orc biology, so completely divorced from the existential anxieties that make other species vulnerable to chaos, that there is simply nowhere for the dark gods to grip. There are orcs in the lore that have been touched by chaos in various ways, warped mutations in the regions nearest the Eye of Terror. But true chaos corruption, the deep soul-level conversion that turns a loyal space marine into a screaming heretic or a devoted priest into a daemon's puppet, simply does not work on orcs. The biological imperative is too strong. The psychic architecture is too self-contained. Chaos reaches in and finds nothing it can hold on to, nothing it can twist, nothing it can offer that is more appealing than what an orc already has. From an orc's perspective, they already live in something close to their ideal universe. They have a never-ending supply of enemies to fight. They have a social hierarchy they can navigate through the simple expedient of hitting whoever is above them until that person falls down. They have technology that works because they believe it works. They have a collective dream, held in the shared unconscious of their gestalt psychic field, that if enough of them gather together and fight hard enough, they will eventually have the greatest fight that has ever been fought. The universe has no shortage of things to hit. Why would any of this require chaos? That collective dream, the deep inarticulate hope in the orc unconscious for the greatest possible battle, is itself a form of psychic energy that feeds something. The orc gods, Gork and Mork, two aspects of a single divine principle, described as brutally cunning and cunningly brutal respectively, exist in the warp. They are not chaos entities. They do not serve the great game. They exist entirely outside the ruinous powers system, occupying their own corner of the Imperium and doing essentially what orcs always do, hitting things. The chaos gods cannot easily destroy or subsume these entities because they are sustained by the psychic output of a species that is constitutionally incapable of being redirected. If the green tide ever truly unified, which happens periodically on smaller scales and produces the events called the Great Green Crusades, the result would be a psychic event of potentially universe-changing proportions. The sheer scale of orc belief, directed and concentrated, might produce something that makes Gork and Mork powerful enough to challenge the Chaos Gods directly. The Chaos Gods prefer the orcs to remain what they are, chaotic and fragmented and constantly fighting each other, almost as much as they fight everyone else. A unified orc civilization is a nightmare that even the ruinous powers prefer not to contemplate. Not because orcs can be killed or defeated by chaos in some clever way, but because they cannot be corrupted and therefore cannot be controlled, and a force that cannot be corrupted and cannot be controlled and grows stronger the more it fights is exactly the kind of thing that gives ancient gods of war and destruction pause. Part 10. the oldest enemy, the Satan, and why the warp quivers. Of all the threats to the Chaos Gods, the Satan are perhaps the most ancient and the most fundamental, the ones that speak to the deepest incompatibility at the heart of the 40K cosmology. Where other threats are powerful for strategic or military reasons, the Satan are threatening at the level of basic metaphysics. They are the wrong kind of thing for the warp to deal with. The Satan are star gods, ancient beyond any mortal reckoning. They existed before the galaxy developed its first intelligent life. They are beings of living energy who fed on the radiation of stars in the earliest epochs of the universe, traversing space at fractions of the speed of light, consuming the output of stellar bodies with the slow deliberateness of creatures for whom millions of years are a relatively short interval. When the Necrontyr offered them physical bodies crafted from living metal, bodies that could interact with the material universe more directly, and feed on a richer source of energy in the form of mortal life forces rather than mere stellar radiation, the Satan accepted, and in doing so, set in motion the entire chain of events that eventually produced the 41st millennium. The Satan have no soul. They have no psychic presence in the warp whatsoever, not in the way that Necrons lack psychic presence by virtue of having lost their souls in biotransference. The Satan never had souls. They were never beings of the warp, and have never interacted with the Imperium in any way that corresponds to how living beings interact with it. They are purely material in the most profound sense. Their power comes from material energy, stellar radiation, nuclear reactions, the fundamental physical processes of the universe, rather than the psychic mirror realm that underlies real space. The mutual antipathy between the Satan and the Chaos Gods is not merely strategic or military. It is cosmological. They represent two fundamentally incompatible forms of cosmic power, where the Chaos Gods exist entirely in the warp and project into real space with difficulty and at cost. The Satan exist entirely in real space and are actually vulnerable to warp energy precisely because of their lack of a presence in the Imperium. Warp energy is so alien to their nature that it can affect them in ways that their purely material defenses do not account for. The weapons the ancient Aeldari forged to fight the Satan, the talismans of Vol described in their mythology, worked by weaponizing warp energy against entities that had no natural defense against it. The ancient war between Satan and the forces that would eventually produce the Chaos Gods was not a direct conflict between aware, plotting entities. It was structural and historical. The Satan, by existing and feeding and driving the wars that devastated the galaxy, were responsible for poisoning the warp, and that poisoned warp eventually produced the Chaos Gods. The Chaos Gods were born from the psychic suffering caused by the wars the Catan enabled. In a cosmological sense, the Catan are partially responsible for the creation of their own most fundamental enemies. And now, in the 41st millennium, after the Necrons shattered the Satan into shards during their ancient revolt and imprisoned those shards in Tesseract vaults, the Satan are no longer the independent cosmic threats they once were. But shards are not deaths. The Satan are incredibly difficult to destroy permanently. Their material nature means they do not dissipate the way warp entities do. When a daemon is destroyed, its warp stuff dissolves back into the immaterium, eventually reforming around the same emotional pattern that originally created it. When a Satan shard is destroyed, the energy that composed it is simply released, often with catastrophic material consequences for everything nearby. But it does not return to a realm of consciousness or reformation. The Chaos Gods are aware that somewhere in the galaxy, imprisoned but not dead, are entities of immense power that are fundamentally, cosmologically opposed to everything they represent. The Satan do not worship. The Satan cannot be corrupted. The Satan have no psychic presence that chaos can exploit or manipulate. And if the Necrons, who control those shards, ever decide to weaponize them against chaos specifically, the results could be devastating to warp entities. More than the specific military threat of the shards, the Satan represent a reminder that not everything in the universe operates within the psychic framework that the Chaos Gods call home. There are forms of power that exist entirely outside the warp, entirely outside the Great Game, entirely outside the endless cycle of emotional energy feeding divine ambition. The Satan predate that cycle. They fed on the universe before consciousness existed to generate emotions. They are, in some sense, older than the chaos gods, in the way that the physics of the cosmos are older than the creatures who evolved to study them. Part 11. The real nightmare, the end of belief, itself. All the specific threats examined so far address particular vulnerabilities of the chaos gods from particular angles. The Necrons' blackstone weapons, the Tyranids' consuming hunger, Ennead's growing power, the Emperor's eternal war, Malice's renegade fury, the Orks' incorruptible simplicity, the Cetans' alien opposition. Each addresses something real and specific. But there is a more abstract threat that underlies all of them, something the lore points toward without always making fully explicit. The chaos gods need emotion. They need belief. They need the constant psychic output of mortal beings experiencing the full spectrum of feelings that define conscious existence. This is their sustenance, their fuel, the medium in which they exist. Remove the emotion and the belief, and the gods diminish, slowly but irreversibly, toward the formless psychic energy from which they came. Most discussions of the chaos gods' vulnerabilities focus on ways to fight them physically, to oppose their power directly. But the more radical thought, the one that some of the most dangerous thinkers in the 40K universe have followed to its logical conclusion, is this. What if the mortal races simply stopped feeding them, not through military action, not through some grand campaign, but through a more fundamental change in what mortal consciousness generates? This is not something that can be achieved through force. You cannot fight your way to emotional absence. The very act of fighting generates rage and fear and the will to survive, all of which feeds the chaos gods. The approach would have to be something more fundamental, something that addresses the architecture of mortal consciousness rather than the actions of mortal bodies. The Emperor's original vision, the imperial truth, was a clumsy attempt in this direction. The understanding that if humanity could be educated out of superstition and the desperate need for divine guidance, the gods who fed on that need would be weakened. It was too blunt an instrument and too poorly understood to really work. Human beings are not easily argued out of their most fundamental emotional responses, and the emotional responses that feed chaos, fear, and rage and desire are among the most fundamental. You cannot simply tell people to stop being afraid, but the Tao's ethos of the greater good, that collective ideology, built around rational cooperation and the subordination of individual desire to collective welfare, represents something that makes the chaos gods uneasy. The Tao are weakly psychic as a species, generating relatively little of the concentrated emotional output that feeds the dark gods. A galaxy full of beings with Tao-like psychic profiles, following Tao-like philosophies of collective purpose rather than individual emotional extremes, would be a dramatically less nourishing place for the ruinous powers. The lore acknowledges this in a fascinating way. There are hints that the chaos gods have specifically targeted the Tao's expansion and philosophy, not because the Tao pose a military threat that chaos cannot handle, but because the idea that the Tao represent, the idea that conscious beings can organize themselves in ways that do not generate the emotional extremes chaos requires, is genuinely threatening to them at an ideological level. And then there is the question of what happens to the chaos gods if the universe eventually runs down. Not in any immediate practical sense, but as a cosmological horizon. The 40K universe operates under physics that include eventual entropic decay. As the stars die and the galaxies cool and the last mortal creatures face whatever end awaits them, the supply of emotional energy flowing into the warp must eventually approach zero. The chaos gods have never faced this directly. By their nature, by the fact that they exist in the warp's strange relationship with causality, they do not necessarily experience the future the way mortals do. But the logic is inexorable. The universe that sustains them is not permanent. At some point, even if that point is so far beyond the current moment as to be mythological in scale, the equation changes. The stars die. The last worlds go cold. The last sentient beings face their final moments. And the chaos gods, sustained by nothing, discover that they were always as mortal as anything else in the universe, just on an incomprehensibly longer timescale. This is perhaps the deepest and most profoundly unsettling thing that the chaos gods know about themselves, if they are capable of truly knowing it. Their existence, which seems so overwhelming and absolute when viewed from the perspective of a single human lifetime, or even a single civilization's span, is ultimately contingent. They were not always there. They will not always be there. The universe will eventually reclaim everything, even entities of pure psychic energy. The Chaos Gods probably do not contemplate this truth often, because to contemplate it directly would be to experience a specific kind of existential despair that would, in the most profound cosmological irony, be excellent fuel for Nurgle. Part 12. The Great Game and its Hidden Stakes. So what does all of this mean? What picture emerges from looking at all the things that threaten, challenge, or genuinely frighten the Chaos Gods in the setting of Warhammer 40,000? It means that the 41st millennium, for all its darkness and horror, and the sheer relentless grimness of its aesthetic, is not simply a universe in which evil is winning. It is a universe in which the most powerful forces of cosmic malice are actually in a more precarious position than they appear. The ruinous powers hold enormous advantages. They have the active corruption of the warp, which touches every psyker and every warp-traveling ship and every vulnerable mind in the galaxy. They have their demonic legions and their chaos space marine warbands and their uncountable mortal cultists. They have the Great Rift, that catastrophic tear in reality that followed the fall of Cadia and split the galaxy into the Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus, the greatest single victory for chaos in 10,000 years. But they also have the Necrons waking up. Dynasty by dynasty, across 100,000 tomb worlds, the ancient dead are opening their eyes, and the Silent King is rebuilding the network that once kept the warp at bay. The Pariah Nexus is not a curiosity or a local tactical project. It is the proof of concept for something that could, given time and resources, become the foundation of a galaxy-scale project to permanently diminish the warp's foothold in real space. They have the Tyranids, which continue to advance despite every effort to stop them. Multiple hive fleets pressing deeper into the galaxy from multiple directions simultaneously. The psychic noise of the shadow in the warp, following each fleet like a cold front, suppressing chaos influence and consuming worlds that previously fed the Great Game with their emotional output. They have Yniad, partially awake and growing stronger with every Aeldari death, an opposing god forming from the souls of the Chaos God's most hunted prey, a deity whose very existence challenges the idea that the warp belongs to chaos. They have the Emperor, still burning on his throne, still fighting the endless psychic war that has kept chaos from completing its victory over humanity, the one psychic presence in the galaxy that the Chaos Gods can neither corrupt nor destroy nor outmaneuver. They have the renegade concept, the anarchy that does not serve them, the self-destructive principle that grows stronger as they grow stronger, and which would, if it ever achieved sufficient power, turn the logic of chaos against the gods themselves. They have the Orks, ungainly and anarchic, and absolutely incorruptible, billions of beings feeding their own gods, and not the dark gods, a species that the ruinous powers cannot control, and therefore cannot fully use. And they have the Satan in their prisons, ancient, alien, cosmologically incompatible with chaos at the most fundamental level, too powerful to safely ignore, and too well guarded to easily reach. The 41st millennium is dark and terrible, and the forces of chaos are genuinely ascendant in many ways. The Great Rift is real. Worlds fall to demonic corruption every day. The Imperium bleeds. The Chaos Gods are more powerful today than they have been since the Horus Heresy, but they are also more surrounded by genuine existential threats than they have been since the War in Heaven. And the threats arrayed against them are diverse, operating by principles that the Chaos Gods cannot simply overpower or corrupt. The Blackstone does not get weaker because Khorne screams at it. The hive mind does not fall to despair because Nurgle tempts it. Yniad does not stop growing because Slaanesh fears it. The Emperor does not stop fighting because Tzeentch plots against him. There is a version of the 40K story. One, the lore, allows you to see if you look at the right angles, in which the grim darkness is not a permanent condition, but a crisis point. A moment when multiple forces are converging simultaneously in ways that could, in principle, change the balance of the galaxy permanently. The Necrons project could succeed. Yniad could fully awaken. The Emperor could be reborn. The Tyranids could be stopped, and the hive mind's shadow could lift from the galaxy. None of these outcomes is guaranteed. All of them are possible. The Chaos Gods know this. That is why the Great Game has a quality, in the current era of the lore, that goes beyond their ordinary eternal scheming. They are not just fighting for dominance. They are fighting for survival. The stakes of the 41st millennium are not ordinary galactic conflict. They are the question of whether the order of things established by the war in heaven and the birth of the Chaos Gods will persist, or whether something new is being born that will replace it entirely. In the grim darkness of the far future, the game is not over. The Chaos Gods are powerful, ancient, and terrible. They have wounded the galaxy in ways that may never fully heal. They have turned heroes into monsters, and saints into sinners, and entire civilizations into sacrifices on their altars. Their influence is everywhere, and their power is real and present and enormously dangerous. But they are afraid. They are afraid of the silent metal legions waking across 100,000 worlds and counting the blackstones they will need for a project that would reorder reality. They are afraid of the shadow that falls across the stars when a hive fleet approaches, that psychic silence that speaks of a hunger even greater and more indifferent than their own. They are afraid of the quiet god forming in the infinity circuits of crashed craft worlds, building itself from the deaths of the people Slanesh hunts. They are afraid of the endless burning light of the corpse emperor who refuses to go out. They are afraid of the renegade concept that grows stronger as they grow stronger. They are afraid of the green tide that laughs at corruption. They are afraid of the old star gods in their prisons, too alien to fear anything but too powerful to ignore. And somewhere in the deepest architecture of their divine consciousness, in whatever they have that serves as a subconscious, they are afraid of the possibility that the universe they depend on will someday, somehow, stop feeding them. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But not all the wars are fought in the dark, and not all the things worth fighting for are lost. If you made it all the way through this one, thank you, genuinely. This kind of deep cosmological dive is one of my favorite territories in all of 40K lore, the places where the setting reveals just how much thought and craft went into its foundations. If you have a favorite threat to the Chaos Gods that I did not cover here, or a theory about what ultimately ends them, drop it in the comments. I want to hear it. Tell me where in the world you are watching from, and what time it is where you are. There is something that makes this whole thing feel more grounded when I know people from different corners of the world are sitting with the same question about imaginary space gods. If this is your first time here, subscribe. There is more lore to cover. There always will be. Expanded deep dives, extended lore notes. The architecture of fear. Understanding how the Chaos Gods experience threat. One of the most interesting questions in all of 40K lore is deceptively simple. Can the Chaos Gods actually feel fear? And if they can, what does that experience look like for entities that are not biological, that do not have nervous systems or stress hormones, or any of the physical machinery that fear requires in mortal organisms? The answer the lore gives is both more interesting and more disturbing than a simple yes or no. The Chaos Gods experience something analogous to fear, but it is not the sharp animal terror of a creature facing a predator. It is closer to what you might call cosmological disturbance, a disruption of the patterns and flows that constitute their consciousness, a recognition that something in the universe is operating against their interests in a way that they cannot simply overpower or corrupt. Each god experiences this in a way characteristic of their domain. Khorne's version of fear would manifest as a kind of rage, directed at something he cannot simply kill, a fury at the existence of an enemy that his most effective weapon, violence, cannot reach. He cannot bleed a Necron pylon. He cannot take a skull from the Tyranid hive mind in any meaningful sense. He cannot fight the growing emptiness that the shadow in the warp creates. His response to threats that his nature does not equip him to address is a rage that becomes directionless, which is actually more dangerous than targeted rage, because it lashes out indiscriminately at anything nearby. Tzientchik's experience of threat is probably the most interesting of the four. The Changer of Ways thrives on uncertainty and possibility. A galaxy full of change and flux and unexpected development is Tzientch's ideal condition. But the Necron's Blackstone project and the Tyranid advance represent kinds of change that converge towards certainty rather than away from it. The Pylon network, if fully deployed, reduces the galaxy toward a stable, predictable state where the warp's influence is consistently limited. The Tyranids reduce the galaxy toward a different kind of certainty, the certainty of nothing, of stripped worlds and silence. These kinds of change are antithetical to Tzeentch's nature. They are not the creative, generative uncertainty he feeds on. They are closure. And closure, in any form, disturbs the changer of ways in ways that even he may not fully understand. Nurgle's relationship to fear is perhaps the most paradoxical, because Nurgle is the god who embodies acceptance of the inevitable. His followers are the least afraid of death in the setting. His entire philosophical domain is built around the idea that decay is not to be feared, but embraced. And yet, the specific kind of ending that the Tyranids represent, a complete and total consumption that leaves nothing for even decay to work on, a stripping so thorough that there is no organic matter remaining to rot and transform, is a kind of death that even Nurgle's philosophy cannot accommodate. Nurgle's cycle requires matter to cycle through. Dead worlds, truly dead worlds, stripped of all biomass, are outside his system. They are sterile in a way that even the most deadly plague does not achieve. A plague still leaves bodies. Tyranid consumption leaves nothing. Slaanesh experiences threat most acutely of the four in the current lore, because Ennead is specifically growing to destroy her. But Slaanesh's experience of Yennead is interesting, because it should, in theory, be terrifying, in a way that Slaanesh finds deeply confusing. Slaanesh feeds on fear as much as on pleasure. The awareness of her own possible destruction should, under normal circumstances, generate a psychic feedback loop that feeds her own power. But Yennead represents something different. Ennead is the god of release, of the letting go, of the acceptance of ending that comes from the Eldari culture's deep engagement with death as a transition rather than a conclusion. Ennead's nature is not the terror of death, it is the peace of it. And peace is the one thing Slaanesh has the most difficulty processing. The Chaos Gods are afraid of these threats in their own characteristic ways, and those characteristic ways make their responses to the threats recognizably, distinctly themselves even in moments of genuine fear. Khorne rages. Tzeentch schemes even harder and faster, generating more plans. Nurgle grows patient and watchful, waiting for an opportunity. Slaanesh deflects, denies, distracts. But underlying all of those responses is a recognition that cannot be entirely suppressed. These threats are real, they are growing. And the great game, for all its millennia of comfortable eternity, may be entering its most uncertain period since the warp's creation. The Great Rift. Chaos wins the battle, risks the war. The Great Rift deserves special attention in any discussion of what threatens the Chaos Gods, because it represents the paradox of their situation in a particularly acute way. The formation of the Great Rift, the galaxy-splitting warp rift that emerged from the destruction of the Cadian pylons, and the accumulated psychic trauma of the Gathering Storm events, was the greatest single chaos victory in 10,000 years. It split the Imperium. It unleashed demonic incursions across hundreds of worlds simultaneously. It created conditions in the Imperium Nihilus, the half of the galaxy cut off from the light of the Astronomicon, where survival became far harder, and chaos influence far stronger. By conventional measures, this was an extraordinary triumph. The Chaos Gods achieved in a single catastrophic event what 10,000 years of Black Crusades had not managed. They broke the barrier. They opened the flood. The Eye of Terror, previously contained around the Cadian Gate region, spilled across the galaxy in a way that cannot be easily reversed. But there are reasons to look at the Great Rift and see a kind of desperation rather than simple triumph. The Chaos Gods needed to destroy the Cadian pylon network with extreme urgency, because that network was beginning to close the Eye of Terror. The destruction of the pylons was not a free choice by confident gods making a strategic move. It was a reaction, a response to something that was threatening them. If the pylons had not been destroyed, the Eye of Terror might have been gradually compressed over centuries, until it was too small to serve as a reliable gate for demonic incursion. The Great Rift is, in one interpretation, what the Chaos Gods did when they realized they needed to go on the offensive or face a slow reversal of their position. And the Great Rift has consequences for the Chaos Gods' own situation that are not entirely positive, yes. More demonic incursions, yes. more suffering and terror and corruption fueling the Great Game, but also more urgency for the threats arrayed against them. The Great Rift woke up the Necrons more broadly. The psychic trauma of the event accelerated developments that might otherwise have played out over centuries more slowly. The partial awakening of Yniad happened in the context of the events surrounding the Gathering Storm. The formation of the Great Rift energized the Imperium in ways that produced Guilliman's resurrection and the development of the Primaris Space Marines, making the Imperium's military position stronger in some ways, even as it was weakened in others. The Great Rift is a wound that chaos inflicted on the galaxy, and wounds do strange things. Sometimes they weaken the wounded. Sometimes they catalyze defenses the wounded did not know they had. The 41st millennium, post-Great Rift, is a galaxy that is simultaneously more chaos-dominant and more urgently mobilized against chaos than it has ever been. The weight of 10,000 years, how time works against chaos. There is a temporal dimension to the threats facing the Chaos Gods that rarely gets explicit attention in the lore, but runs underneath everything. The Chaos Gods are ancient. They measure time in geological epochs. 10,000 years, the entire span of the 41st millennium that provides the setting for most of the game's lore, is a relatively short period by the standards of entities who watched civilizations rise and fall for millions of years before humanity discovered agriculture. But 10,000 years is enough time for certain trends to accumulate meaningfully. 10,000 years of the Emperor's vigil, slowly changing whatever it is the Emperor is becoming. 10,000 years of Eldari deaths, adding their souls to the infinity circuits and feeding Ynid's growth. 10,000 years of Necron Tomb, worlds slowly coming back online, dynasty by dynasty, as their stasis fields gradually fail or are deliberately deactivated. 10,000 years of Tyrannid advance, each hive fleet pressing deeper into the galaxy, consuming more worlds, extending the shadow in the warp across more of the galactic disk. Each of these processes is slow by mortal standards. No single Eldari death changes Yniad meaningfully. No single Necron dynasty awakening constitutes a strategic shift. No single stripped Tyrannid world changes the galactic psychic landscape. But 10,000 years of each of these processes operating simultaneously creates a cumulative pressure that the Chaos Gods have to respond to, and responding costs them resources and attention that they would rather direct toward the Great Game. The temporal dimension also matters, because the Chaos Gods' attention is not infinitely divisible. For all their power, they are constrained by the simple fact that the Great Game requires their attention, and their servants require direction. And every threat that demands response diverts resources from the core project of expanding their influence. When the forces of chaos spend centuries specifically targeting Necron pylon installations, those are centuries not spent corrupting Imperial worlds. When chaos warbands are dispatched to harry the Tyrannid advance, those are forces not available for other operations. Time, in other words, may be the most fundamental threat of all, not because the Chaos Gods face a deadline, but because every year that passes without a decisive victory is a year in which the various counterforces in the galaxy continue to develop and grow. The Necron project advances. Ynid grows. The Emperor endures. The Orks multiply. The C'tan wait in their prisons. And the Chaos Gods, who have the advantage today, have to keep winning. Their opponents only have to keep existing. What the daemons know and do not say. The daemons of chaos are an interesting vector for understanding what the Chaos Gods fear, because daemons are fragments of the gods themselves, portions of divine consciousness given form and sent into the material universe or left to war in the warp. They know what the gods know, in the particular, partial way that a fragment of something knows what the whole knows. And some of the most revealing information in the lore comes not from the gods directly, but from daemons letting things slip in conversations with mortals. The greater daemons, the bloodthirsters of Khorne, and the great unclean ones of Nurgle, and the lord changers of Tzientch, and the keepers of secrets of Slaanesh, are the most powerful of these fragments. They are old, in many cases older than recorded human history, and they have perspective that spans the entire current period of the galaxy's history. When they speak, which they do with various degrees of honesty and deception, they occasionally let slip things that are more revealing than their gods would probably prefer. The lore notes, in various places, that certain greater demons become visibly disturbed when the topic of the Necrons comes up. Not in the way that a mortal enemy's name disturbs a warrior, not with the sharp readiness of combat reflex, but with something more like the discomfort of a creature that has encountered something it cannot properly process. The Necrons, from a daemon's perspective, simply should not exist in the way they do. Everything the daemon understands about the universe says that soulless things of that scale should not be able to sustain themselves, should not be able to maintain coherent purpose, should not be capable of the kind of long-term planning that the Necron dynasties clearly execute. The absence of psychic warmth where so much strategic intelligence clearly resides is, to a daemon, a deep and unresolvable wrongness. Similarly, daemons who have encountered the shadow in the warp firsthand describe it in terms that suggest genuine alarm. Not the excitement that a daemon might feel when facing a powerful enemy who could be destroyed or corrupted, but something closer to existential displacement. The shadow in the warp does not feel like an enemy. It does not feel like anything. It is absence masquerading as presence, and for beings whose entire existence is defined by a specific kind of psychic presence, that kind of absence is more frightening than any positive threat. The daemons understand something that their gods may be reluctant to fully acknowledge. The threats arrayed against chaos in the 41st millennium are not the usual kind of threats, not armies that can be corrupted, or heroes that can be tempted, or civilizations that can be gradually destabilized from within. Several of the most serious threats are immune to chaos's primary tools, in ways that cannot be overcome with more effort, or more devotion, or more clever planning. You cannot corrupt a Blackstone pylon. You cannot tempt the hive mind with forbidden knowledge. You cannot bribe Yinid into stopping its growth. These threats have to be physically destroyed, and physical destruction is a much harder task for entities that are fundamentally non-physical than for entities with bodies and armies and weapons. The question of what comes next. The lore leaves the eventual fate of the Chaos Gods deliberately open, which is the right artistic decision for a setting with as much active narrative development as 40K. But thinking through the logical possibilities, based on what the lore has established, is one of the more interesting exercises in this hobby. There are a few plausible trajectories that the threads in the current narrative suggest. The Necron separation scenario is the most strategically interesting. If the Silent King's project succeeds, if the Blackstone network is extended far enough and maintained well enough, the material universe gradually becomes less accessible to the warp. The Chaos Gods do not die immediately in this scenario. The warp still exists. They still have their existing power, and their existing demonic populations, and their existing territories in the Imperium, but they cannot replenish that power from the material universe. The great game continues in the warp, consuming the power that already exists there, and over time, over very long time, the system runs down. The gods fight each other until the resources that sustain them are exhausted. It is a slow and graceless end, lacking the dramatic finality of a great battle, but it may be the most realistic scenario for what the Necron project is ultimately building toward. The Yinid intervention scenario is more dramatically satisfying from a narrative perspective. Yinid finishes forming, achieves sufficient power to challenge Slaanesh directly, and the resulting confrontation between the Death God and the God of Excess reshapes the warp permanently. Slaanesh's portion of the great game is consumed or destroyed. The Aeldari, freed from the curse of She Who Thirsts, either rebuild their civilization or exhaust themselves entirely in the fight. The remaining three Chaos Gods find themselves with a fundamentally altered warp to inhabit, the balance of the great game permanently disrupted, and eventually their mutual dependence becomes explicit rather than implicit, as each realizes the system requires all four to function at the level they are accustomed to. The Emperor Reborn scenario is the one that generates the most theological controversy in-universe and the most narrative excitement outside it. The Star Child gestating in the warp, formed from 10,000 years of sacrifice and worship and the Emperor's own psychic transformation on the Golden Throne, finally achieves sufficient coherence to manifest as something genuinely new. A human warp god, an embodiment of hope and collective purpose, and the stubborn refusal of humanity to be consumed by the dark, rising into the warp as an entity that the Chaos Gods have no playbook for, because it represents something that has never existed before. The implications of this scenario for the galaxy's future are almost impossible to fully predict, but the word hope keeps appearing in descriptions of what it might mean. What all these scenarios share is a recognition that the current state of the 41st millennium is not stable. The various forces in play are too dynamic, too opposed, too urgently developing to simply continue in their current configuration indefinitely. Something will give. The only question is what gives first, and what that giving looks like. The Chaos Gods know this. In the deepest level of their divine consciousness, in the part that is not consumed by the great game's immediate demands and the management of their demonic legions and their eternal war with each other, there is a recognition that has been growing for at least the 10,000 years of the current millennium. They are not winning. They are not losing. They are in the eye of a storm that has not fully arrived yet, and the things gathered at the edges of that storm are unlike anything that has stood against them before. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the most important wars are being fought not with bolters and power swords, but with time and silence and the slow accumulation of consequences. The galaxy is choosing, world by world and dynasty by dynasty and soul by soul, what it will become. And the Chaos Gods, for all their eternity and power and terrible wisdom, do not know how that choice will ultimately fall. That uncertainty is the most profound thing in their existence, and uncertainty, unresolved in building, is itself a kind of fear. Thank you for being here for this. The lore of Warhammer 40K rewards the kind of deep looking that asks not just what happened, but why the universe is arranged the way it is, what the structural forces are that produce the events we read about in codexes and novels and campaign books. These questions do not always have clean answers. The setting is deliberately ambiguous in many places, keeping options open, letting players and readers project their own understanding onto the gaps. But the ambiguities are themselves revealing. The gaps are in the shape of the things that most matter. Tell me in the comments where you are watching this from. What time is it where you are? Whether you found something here that changed how you think about the Chaos Gods, or whether there is a thread I should have pulled harder on, this conversation continues in the comment section, and I genuinely read it. If you are not subscribed and you want more of this, subscribe. The grim darkness of the far future has plenty more lore to explore together. The extended historical context, 60 million years of the warp story. To truly understand what threatens the Chaos Gods, you have to understand the warp not as a static backdrop, but as a system with a history, a system that was genuinely different in the deep past, and that is being shaped, right now, by forces that are changing it again. The warp's history is the history of the Chaos Gods, and knowing where they came from illuminates every single thing that threatens them today. The earliest references in the 40K lore describe a time when the warp was not the boiling, predatory hell it is in the 41st millennium. When the Old Ones moved through the Imperium as their primary mode of travel and communication, they did so through an environment that was unsettling and strange by mortal standards, but navigable. A realm of flowing psychic energy that reflected the emotions and thoughts of living creatures, but had not yet developed the dangerous concentrations of self-aware malice that define it today. The Old Ones were extraordinary. By any standard of measurement, they were among the most advanced beings the galaxy has ever produced. They were old when the Milky Way's current generation of stars was forming. They had mastered the warp as a tool, using it for travel and communication, and possibly for purposes that have no mortal analog. They had the ability to engineer life at the genetic level, not just the simple genetic manipulation that the 41st millennium's Adeptus Mechanicus might attempt, but a deep and fundamental reshaping of an organism's relationship with the universe, including its relationship with the psychic dimension. The Aeldari are the most obvious example of their work, a species engineered to have an extraordinarily strong and rich psychic presence in the warp. The Orks are another. Even humanity, some theories suggest, shows traces of Old One influence in its unusually rapid development of psychic potential. The Old Ones had enemies. The Necrontire, that bitter and radiation-scorched species orbiting a dying star, resented everything the Old Ones represented. The Old Ones were immortal and powerful, and seemingly indifferent to the Necrontyre's suffering. When the Necrontire asked the Old Ones for the secret of their immortality, the Old Ones refused, and that refusal poisoned any possibility of cooperation and drove the Necrontyr toward the desperate bargain with the Satan that would eventually transform them into the Necrons. The war in heaven that followed was the defining event of the current galactic age. Everything that exists in the 41st millennium traces back to that conflict, directly or indirectly. The Chaos Gods themselves are children of that war, born from the psychic suffering it generated. The Orks and the Eldari exist because the Old Ones created them as weapons in that war. The Webway, the network of tunnels outside normal space that the Eldari use for travel and the Imperium covets, was built by the Old Ones to allow interstellar travel without using the increasingly dangerous warp. Even humanity's psychic awakening, the surge in psyker births that defines the 41st millennium's desperate quality, is partly a consequence of genetic changes set in motion by the Old Ones millions of years ago. And the Chaos Gods, born from the suffering of that war, have spent the subsequent 60 million years growing stronger as the galaxy's history has continued to generate exactly the kind of emotional extremes that sustain them. The fall of the Eldari and the birth of Slaanesh was the most recent major event in this long history of pain being converted to divine power. Every atrocity, every war, every empire's rise and collapse has fed the great game, made the gods stronger, deepened the warp's corruption. But 60 million years is also a long time for counterforces to develop. The Old Ones, though apparently extinct, left behind a galaxy seeded with species they engineered, and some of those species are proving to be problems for the gods born from that seeding. The Orks, designed specifically to operate outside the psychic framework the Cetans sought to use against the Old Ones, are immune to the chaos corruption that affects other species. The Eldari, designed to be supremely psychic, have used that psychic nature not just to feed chaos, but to begin growing a new god that threatens one of the four. And humanity, whose extraordinary psychic potential was probably shaped partly by Old One influence, has produced the Emperor, the single most dangerous individual opponent the Chaos Gods have ever faced. There is a pattern here that is worth noting. The Old Ones, in designing species to fight one set of enemies, the Satan and Necrons, inadvertently created several species that would eventually develop into threats to the enemies the Old Ones would never live to see. The Old Ones are gone, their work remains, and some of that work is, 60 million years later, bearing fruit that the Chaos Gods find profoundly alarming. The psychic landscape, understanding the warp as an ecosystem. One of the things that makes 40K lore so rich is that the warp is not just a setting feature. It is almost a character in its own right, with its own ecology and dynamics and internal relationships that shape everything else in the universe. Understanding the warp as an ecosystem, with predators and prey, and resource competition, and carrying capacity, illuminates why the Chaos Gods face the threats they face in the ways they face them. The warp's carrying capacity, if you want to use an ecological metaphor, is determined by the emotional output of the material universe's sentient inhabitants. This is the resource that all warp entities compete for. The Chaos Gods are the dominant apex predators in this ecosystem, but they are not the only entities with a stake in the available psychic energy. Smaller warp entities, creatures that do not rise to the level of gods, also compete for this resource. The Enslavers, strange worm-like creatures that emerge from the warp to possess psychers and use them as portals for further incursion, were a major factor in the War in Heaven's conclusion. Warp predators of various scales and types constantly test the boundaries of real space, looking for vulnerabilities they can exploit. The Chaos Gods maintain their dominance partly through sheer scale and partly through the fact that they control the most significant concentrations of warp territory. Their realms are established ecological zones, in a sense, areas of the Imperium where their specific emotional signature is dominant and where other warp entities must either serve them or compete from a position of permanent disadvantage. But this ecological model reveals something important about the threats to chaos. Any force that reduces the total emotional output feeding into the warp reduces the carrying capacity of the entire ecosystem. This hurts the Chaos Gods more than it hurts smaller warp entities, precisely because the gods have grown so large. Large predators are more vulnerable to ecosystem collapse than small ones, because they require more resources to sustain themselves. A small warp predator can persist on relatively modest psychic energy inputs. The Chaos Gods, at their current scale, require an enormous and continuous supply. The Necron Pylon project is an ecosystem intervention. It does not attack the Chaos Gods directly. It shrinks the ecosystem they inhabit. The Tyranid Advance is an ecosystem collapse from the resource supply side, consuming the organic material that generates the psychic energy the warp needs. It is, in ecological terms, the emergence of a new apex predator in the warp, one that will compete with the existing apex predators for dominance in the ecosystem. The Emperor can be understood as the largest individual predator-free zone in the ecosystem. His psychic presence in the warp does not feed the Chaos Gods. It actively pushes against them, displacing their influence from the areas around Terra and the Astronomican's reach. He is, in ecological terms, a protected area in the warp, a zone where chaos cannot operate at full strength because the environment itself resists them. This ecological framing also explains why the Chaos Gods must respond to these threats even when their individual scale might suggest they could simply ignore them. Ecosystem pressures are cumulative and compounding. A species that can afford to lose 20% of its food base might not be able to afford to lose 30% because the gap between viable and non-viable population can be a narrow one. The Chaos Gods are, by their nature, always operating at the edge of the scale that their power allows, always expanding into new emotional territory, always needing more. A sustained reduction in available psychic resources does not just weaken them proportionally. It risks tipping them below the threshold they need to maintain consciousness and coherent will. The lives lived in the shadow. What mortals experience of this conflict, every discussion of the Chaos Gods and the threats they face, risks becoming so cosmological that the mortal beings who actually live in the 41st millennium get lost in abstraction. But the threats to chaos have very real, very immediate consequences for ordinary people and ordinary soldiers and ordinary worlds. The Pariah Nexus is not just a strategic project, it is a lived experience for the humans and other beings caught within its expanding boundaries. People who grew up with the faint background psychic hum of the Imperium, always present at the edge of awareness, find that hum disappearing. Psychers lose their connection to the warp entirely, which for some is relief and for others is a kind of amputation. The emotional flatness that descends on populations within a pylon zone is noted in the lore as deeply unsettling, a creeping emotional numbness that strips ordinary experience of some of its resonance. People still feel things, but there is a quality missing, a depth that was always there before that is now simply absent. The Tyranid Advance is experienced by its victims in ways that no abstract discussion of psychic resources captures. The shadow in the warp, before the physical hive fleet arrives, is felt by psychers as a building pressure, a sense of something immense approaching, a cold void spreading across their awareness that drowns out everything else. People who are not psychers often report disturbing dreams in the months before a hive fleet arrives in their system, as the shadow's effects ripple into non-psychic consciousness in indirect ways. Animals become disturbed, plants grow strangely. There is a wrongness in the air that no one can articulate but everyone can feel. And then the hive fleet arrives, and there is no more time for feelings about it. The war against chaos, from the perspective of the people who fight it on the ground and in the void and in the psychic dimension simultaneously, is a war fought under conditions that are barely comprehensible to the mortals experiencing them. They know they are fighting demons. They know there are gods involved. They know the stakes are civilization scale at minimum and existence scale at maximum. They mostly do not know that the things most likely to produce a better long-term outcome are things entirely outside their ability to control or influence. Ancient machines waking under distant stars, alien gods forming from the accumulated deaths of a dying people, an undying emperor slowly becoming something new over 10 millennia. The mortal perspective is, in some ways, the most honest perspective on the conflict. From inside it, without the cosmological overview that lore discussion provides, what you see is a galaxy that is both worse than it has ever been and also, somehow, inexplicably, still fighting, still producing heroes, still generating the kind of stubborn refusal to simply give up and let darkness win that has characterized humanity's experience of this setting since the first editions. The Chaos Gods do not find that refusal inspiring. They find it irritating, then threatening, then, at the cosmological level, genuinely alarming. Because the mortal refusal to give up is itself a form of psychic energy. It is hope, and while hope also feeds Tzeentch, it has a quality at scale that is more dangerous to chaos than the simple emotional energy it provides. Collective hope, sustained over time against overwhelming odds, has a self-reinforcing character that individual emotions do not. It tends to produce more of itself. A civilization that learns to hope under terrible conditions becomes better at hoping, and that capacity compounds in ways that are difficult for the Chaos Gods to extinguish without destroying the civilization entirely, which is exactly what they keep trying to do, and which keeps not quite working. The question that the lore asks without answering. Warhammer 40K is many things, but one thing it does very well, especially in its deeper lore, is sit with unanswerable questions and let them resonate. The setting does not, ultimately, tell you whether the Imperium will survive. It does not tell you whether the Emperor will be reborn. It does not tell you whether the Tyranids will be stopped, or the Necron Project will succeed, or Ynid will defeat Slaanesh. These are open questions, and they are open by design. But the question that the lore is asking, underneath all the specific scenario questions, is something more fundamental. The question is whether the universe is redeemable. Not whether the Imperium is good, not whether humanity deserves to survive. The more fundamental question, the one that the very existence of the threats to chaos points toward, is whether the universe is the kind of place where the forces of suffering and entropy and despair always win, or whether there is, built into the structure of things, some counterpressure that pushes back towards something better. The Chaos Gods represent the argument that the answer is no. They are the concentrated essence of everything that is worst about consciousness, everything that conscious beings do to each other out of fear and rage and desire and the desperate need to matter. They are real and powerful and ancient and sustained by the very nature of what it means to be a thinking being in a universe that does not particularly care about your existence. But everything that threatens them represents a different argument. The Necron's ancient technology, built by beings who refuse to accept the warp's dominance and have been working against it for millions of years. Ynid, growing from the accumulated deaths of people who chose to preserve something of themselves rather than feed it to the thing that consumed them. The Emperor, a being who looked at everything that conscious life could become and chose to spend his entire existence working against the worst of those possibilities. The Orks, who are honestly kind of just having a good time and are somehow, in their cheerful violence, one of the most effective natural barriers against chaos corruption in the galaxy. These things do not constitute proof that the universe is redeemable. They are not guaranteed to succeed. Most realistic assessments of the 41st millennium situation would not be optimistic, but they do constitute evidence that the question is still open, that the answer has not been given yet. And in a universe where there is only war, the most radical thing imaginable is to look at everything arrayed against you and decide that the question is worth continuing to fight over. One final thought, the oldest fear. The lore of the Chaos Gods is vast and complex, and sometimes contradictory, as all great living mythologies are. It has been developed over decades by hundreds of writers and designers, each bringing their own perspective and contributing their own fragments to the whole. The result is not always internally consistent, but it has a coherence at the thematic level that more than compensates for its occasional factual gaps. And at the thematic level, the deepest and oldest fear the Chaos Gods have is the simplest one. It is the fear that they were never inevitable, that the universe did not have to produce them, that the warp did not have to become the boiling hell it is, that the war in heaven did not have to go the way it went. And if a handful of things had been different, the galaxy today might be a place where 4 gods of terror and corruption did not hold the fate of 1 billion worlds in their hands. The Chaos Gods need to believe they are inevitable. They need to believe that the suffering and fear and rage of conscious beings will always produce something like them, that as long as there is life, there will be chaos. Because if they are not inevitable, if they are instead contingent, the product of specific historical accidents that could have gone differently, then they are not eternal in the way they present themselves. They are just very large, very old mistakes. And if the things arrayed against them in the 41st millennium are any indication, the universe is still deciding whether they were the kind of mistake that gets corrected. That question, living in the architecture of a game about war and space and gothic horror, is one of the most interesting things any fictional universe has ever quietly asked about the nature of evil and whether it is truly permanent. And it is one of the reasons that 40,000 years of grim darkness continues to hold the imagination so completely. The Chaos Gods are afraid of what the answer might be, and they should be. Thank you for spending this time exploring the deepest corners of the 40K cosmos. If you want to continue the conversation, the comment section is open. Where are you watching from? What time is it? What do you think the 41st millennium story is actually about at its core? Drop it below. Subscribe if you want more. There is always more. The anatomy of a cosmic threat. Why these forces are different from everything else. It is worth taking some time to articulate precisely why the threats discussed in this video are categorically different from the kinds of opposition the Chaos Gods face every single day and manage without much apparent concern. Because there is a world of difference between a threat that the Chaos Gods can absorb, redirect, or incorporate into their power, and a threat that they genuinely cannot process by their usual means. The Chaos Gods are excellent at most forms of opposition. When the Imperium sends armies against demonic incursions, the violence of those armies feeds Khorne. When the Inquisition burns heretics, the terror of the executions and the burning faith that drives the witch hunters both contribute psychic resonance to the warp in ways that make the gods stronger, not weaker. When Space Marines charge into a chaos warband screaming the Emperor's name, their righteous anger is a form of intense emotion that the warp happily absorbs. The Chaos Gods have spent so long in a galaxy full of opposition that they have become extraordinarily good at converting opposition into sustenance. This is why fighting chaos with violence is, at best, a holding action. You can kill demons. You can drive back chaos Space Marine invasions. You can burn cults and purge corruption and do everything that the billions of servants of the Imperium do every day in service of holding the line. All of that is necessary and important and keeps civilizations alive and worlds free from demonic occupation. But none of it weakens the Chaos Gods in any fundamental sense. The fighting generates emotion, and emotion feeds the warp. The threats in this video are different in a specific, precise way. They do not fight the Chaos Gods. They either remove the medium the gods depend on, bypass the framework the gods operate within, or introduce forces into the equation that the gods cannot convert into power through their normal methods. The Blackstone pylons do not generate any emotional response that benefits the Chaos Gods. They simply function, suppressing warp energy mechanically, providing no anger or hope or despair for the gods to absorb. They are not even an enemy in the conventional sense. They are an absence of medium. The Tyranid hive mind does not feel the emotions that feed the Chaos Gods. The individual Tyranid organisms that fight are driven by biological programming, rather than the kind of conscious emotional experience that generates psychic resonance in the warp. When a Tyranid warrior dies, it does not experience fear or hope or despair. It simply stops functioning. The psychic residue of that death does not contribute to the great game, and the worlds, the Tyranid strip, are left in a state that generates nothing at all. Inid grows from Eldari deaths, but those deaths go to Inid rather than to the Chaos Gods. Slaanesh, who would normally claim each Eldari soul at death, finds those souls redirected to a different destination through the mechanism of the Spirit Stones and the Infinity Circuits. The emotional energy of an Eldari life does not reach the warp in the form that feeds the great game. It goes instead to a competing god that is actively growing to oppose the great game. From Slaanesh's perspective, this is not just lost income. It is income being given to a rival who plans to use it to destroy her. The Emperor does generate psychic resonance in the warp. The faith of 1 trillion humans praying to him does flow into the Imperium, but it does not flow to the Chaos Gods. It flows to a being who opposes them, who uses that psychic energy not to sustain divine indulgence, but to maintain a constant psychic war that limits chaos's reach. The Emperor converts the faith of his people into a directed suppression of chaos influence, which is precisely the opposite of what normally happens when mortal devotion generates psychic energy. Malice consumes power directly from the Chaos Gods themselves, feeding on their strength, rather than on the mortal emotions that sustain them. He is a drain on their system from within, a leakage that grows worse as the system grows larger. The Orks generate their own closed psychic loop that neither feeds the Chaos Gods nor provides access points for chaos corruption. They are, from the Warp's perspective, a sealed system, billions of beings creating and consuming their own psychic energy in a circuit that never opens to external Warp influence. The C'tan are entirely outside the psychic framework the Chaos Gods call home, operating by physical laws rather than psychic ones, immune to corruption and unable to be tempted or manipulated by means the gods have spent millions of years perfecting. Each of these threats has in common the characteristic that it does not play the game by the rules. The Chaos Gods have spent millions of years learning to dominate. They introduce moves that the existing playbook does not cover, and entities whose power comes from their mastery of a specific game are vulnerable in ways they cannot easily address when someone shows up with a different game entirely. The deep lore of soullessness, what it means to be warp invisible. The concept of being invisible to the warp, of casting no psychic shadow, is explored extensively through the Necrons in the lore, but it has implications that extend beyond the Necrons themselves to touch on several other aspects of the setting. Understanding what warp invisibility really means, and why it is specifically threatening to entities who depend on psychic perception, illuminates a lot. For the Chaos Gods, perception of the material universe is primarily psychic. They do not have eyes that scan real space. They do not have instruments that monitor physical space. They perceive the material universe through the emotional resonance that its inhabitants generate in the warp, and through the specific psychic presences of individual beings and concentrations of beings. A world full of 1 billion people generates a bright, complex psychic signature that the gods can feel across the Imperium. A well-populated hive city is like a beacon, a frontier world in crisis. Its population experiencing extreme fear and suffering is like a fire that calls daemons as surely as a pheromone trail calls insects. The Necrons, psychically invisible, move through this landscape undetected. When a Necron tomb world activates and begins deploying its forces, the first indication the Chaos Gods have of this event is not a psychic perception but a material effect, a sudden and unexpected reduction in the psychic output of a region as the Necron forces begin operating and the regions around their installations begin to show the effects of proximity to anti-warp technology. The gods perceive the Necrons not by sensing them, but by noticing their effects, the way you notice a shadow, not by seeing the thing casting it, but by the absence of light. This inversion of the normal detection mechanism is deeply disorienting for entities built around psychic perception. The Chaos Gods are accustomed to sensing threats approach. Tsiench's great web of plans is built around his ability to see the psychic trajectories of the beings whose choices will determine the future. When a species moves through the galaxy without those trajectories, his planning is compromised in ways that have no easy fix. He can sense the absence of expected signals, but absence is much harder to interpret than presence. The Tau provide a smaller-scale example of the same phenomenon. Their psychic signature in the warp is unusually dim compared to other intelligent species of comparable population. This has led to various lore discussions about why Chaos has generally had a harder time corrupting Tau worlds than human worlds of comparable size, and the dim psychic signature seems to be at least part of the answer. The Chaos Gods cannot as easily identify Tau populations as rich corruption targets, because those populations simply do not glow as brightly in the Imperium. They do not generate the psychic hotspots of despair and rage and hope that make human worlds so appealing. Extended across a much larger scale, the Necron Blackstone Project represents the ultimate expression of this principle. Not just making individual beings or species hard to sense, but making entire regions of space psychically opaque, creating what amounts to patches of darkness in the warp's map of the material universe, zones where the Imperium cannot see, cannot reach, cannot influence, growing those patches over time. Eventually, if the project succeeded fully, creating a galaxy that was mostly dark to psychic perception, a galaxy where the Chaos Gods were effectively blind to large portions of real space. A blind god is still powerful, Khorne's warriors do not need his direction to commit violence. Nurgle's plagues do not need his guidance to spread. But a god that cannot perceive its environment, cannot plan effectively, cannot identify opportunities for corruption before they close, cannot direct its resources to where they are most needed. The strategic intelligence that makes the Chaos Gods so effective at long-term manipulation of galactic events depends on their ability to sense and respond to the emotional landscape of the material universe. Remove that sensing capability, and their strategic intelligence is crippled, even if their raw power is unchanged. Hope as a weapon. The counterintuitive truth about what actually weakens chaos. The lore of Warhammer 40K is often read as a dystopian horror story about a universe where there is no hope and no good outcomes, where everything meaningful is doomed and the darkness always wins in the end. And there is real support for that reading in many parts of the setting. The Imperium is a brutal, oppressive theocracy that sacrifices millions of its own people to sustain itself. The Space Marines are weapons that were made from humans at great cost and are themselves tools of an institution that does terrible things in the name of survival. The Eldar are a dying people whose best available future involves their god eating the god that destroyed their civilization. This is not a cheerful universe. But there is another thread in the lore, less often discussed, that runs alongside the darkness. The thread that says genuine faith, genuine hope, genuine solidarity between people are actually among the most effective things mortals can do against the Chaos Gods. Not because optimism defeats evil through the power of positive thinking, but because of the specific psychic mechanics of the setting. The Chaos Gods feed most effectively on extremes, on the sharp, hot peaks of emotional experience, the rage that Khorne loves, the despair that Nurgle embraces, the intoxicating desire that Slaanesh craves, the manic hope and desperate plotting that fuels Tzeentch. What they do not process as efficiently is the quieter, more sustained emotional states, the steady warmth of a community that has decided to face difficulty together, the calm determination of someone who is afraid but choosing to act anyway. The simple human dignity of people maintaining their values under pressure. These quieter states still generate psychic resonance. They still contribute something to the warp, but they do not produce the sharp peaks that most efficiently feed divine power. A community that is desperately afraid is more useful to chaos than a community that is maintaining reasonable hope under difficult circumstances. A society torn by faction and hatred is more useful than a society maintaining solidarity. This is why chaos always seeks to amplify conflict and despair, rather than simply being present as an option. The amplification is not gratuitous, it is strategic. It converts ordinary emotional experience into the high-yield form that feeds the great game most effectively. And this means that communities that successfully resist despair and maintain solidarity and dignity under pressure are, in a very real sense, engaged in a form of psychic resistance to chaos that goes beyond whatever weapons they might carry. They are denying the great game the specific form of emotional energy it most needs. Not eliminating their contribution to the warp, but making it less useful to the gods. The Imperial Creed, whatever its many genuine problems, does something like this by accident. By giving billions of people a framework of shared meaning and a sense that their suffering has purpose and that they are part of something larger than themselves, it sustains a kind of collective hope that, however manipulated and corrupted and used for institutional purposes, genuinely reduces the emotional yield available to chaos from those populations, compared to what the same populations in a state of atomized despair would produce. This is one reason the Chaos Gods work so hard to infiltrate and corrupt the Imperium's institutions from within, rather than simply destroying them. An Imperium that maintains the faith of its people, even an imperfect and brutal faith, is less useful to chaos than an Imperium whose faith has been corroded into despair and cynicism, and the terrible emptiness that follows when a people discovers that everything they believed in was a lie. The Chaos Gods want that disillusionment. They feed on the specific psychic flavor of faith turned to ash. And this means that the people who maintain their humanity, their basic dignity, their care for each other, even in the most desperate circumstances of the 41st millennium, are not just surviving. They are, in a cosmological sense that they themselves probably do not understand, contributing to the pressure against chaos. every community that chooses solidarity over fragmentation, every soldier who is afraid but acts with courage anyway, every healer who treats enemies as well as allies, every teacher who maintains the value of understanding, even when the institution says understanding is dangerous. These are not the heroic acts that get recorded in codexes and novels, but they are part of the same story. The story of whether the universe is the kind of place where the worst of what consciousness produces always wins, or whether there is something else in the equation. The Chaos Gods cannot eliminate these quiet resistances, any more than they can eliminate the Necron Blackstone pylons, or the growing mass of Yniad. They can suppress them, corrupt them, amplify the factors that undermine them, but they cannot make them stop being possible. Consciousness, the same consciousness that generates the emotions that feed the great game, also has the capacity for exactly the kinds of experience that the great game requires in its most concentrated form, but that, in their more diffuse and sustainable expressions, work against its dominance. That is perhaps the most genuinely hopeful thing the 40K lore has to say, embedded in a universe that otherwise seems designed to discourage hope entirely. The same nature that makes mortals useful to the Chaos Gods also makes them capable of choices that threaten those gods. It cannot be engineered out. It cannot be corrupted away permanently. It is part of what consciousness is, and the Chaos Gods have to live with that. The silence between stars. What a galaxy without chaos would feel like. It is worth asking, as a closing thought experiment, what the galaxy would actually look like if all the threats discussed in this video succeeded. Not whether that is possible, not whether it is desirable, just what it would mean for the people and beings who live in the Milky Way if the Chaos Gods were genuinely diminished or destroyed. The immediate obvious answer is that demonic incursions would stop. The Eye of Terror would stabilize, then shrink, then perhaps close. The countless warp rifts that scar the galaxy's face would slowly heal. The warp itself would become calmer, more navigable, less dangerous to traverse. Ships that currently lose entire crews to psychic horrors during warp transit would make their journeys in conditions closer to what the old ones experienced when the Imperium was young. Psychers would be less likely to be possessed, less likely to burn out, less likely to become vectors for demonic incursion. The constant background pressure of chaos corruption, the gradual erosion of values and sanity that the ruinous powers maintain as a constant environmental feature of the galaxy would ease. That is the positive case. But the setting is too honest about the nature of its universe to leave the story there. The emotions that produce the Chaos Gods would not disappear. Rage and despair and desire and hope are not going away as long as conscious beings exist. And conscious beings, as the 40K lore makes absolutely clear, are going to continue existing. The galaxy is full of them and will be full of them for the foreseeable future of any narrative timescale that matters. So the psychic energy that currently feeds the Chaos Gods would still be generated. It would just no longer have the specific concentrations, the specific self-aware consumer entities that currently harvest it and convert it into divine power. What would the warp look like then, without the Chaos Gods consuming that energy? The lore suggests that the warp, left without those dominant concentrating intelligences, would become something more like the early warp the old ones knew. Still, a dimension of psychic energy, still reflecting the emotions of the material universe, still potentially dangerous in the areas where those emotions were most concentrated and most extreme. But without the four great organizing principles of the Dark Gods, to give that energy shape and direction and malign purpose, it would be less purposefully predatory, less coordinated, more like weather than like warfare. There would still be warp creatures. There would still be dangers in the Imperium. The deep sea has predators, even without a god of the deep sea, directing them. But they would be natural hazards rather than divine enemies. And there is a meaningful difference between those two categories in terms of what you can do about them. The bigger question is what would fill the space. Nature, the lore suggests, does not tolerate vacuums easily. If the Chaos Gods were diminished sufficiently, other entities in the warp would presumably grow to fill the available psychic space. Whether those entities would be better or worse than the current occupants depends on factors that the lore is not willing to predict. Yniad might become more powerful in a warp without chaos as a counterbalancing force. The Emperor, if he were reborn as something new, might occupy a different kind of role in the Imperium's ecology. Gork and Mork, freed from the competition of the ruinous powers, might expand their influence in ways that are better or worse for the rest of the galaxy, depending on your feelings about the Orks. The point is that the 40K universe is not built toward a clean, satisfying ending, where evil is destroyed and everyone lives happily ever after. Even the scenarios most favorable to the galaxy's mortal inhabitants leave a universe that is still complex, still dangerous, still requiring constant work to navigate. The removal of the Chaos Gods from the equation would not create a paradise. It would create a different set of problems, a different balance of forces, a different quality of danger. But it would be a galaxy where the specific nightmares of the 41st millennium, the demonic incursions, and the chaos corruption, and the warp storms and the constant erosion of everything worth preserving in civilized life, those specific nightmares would be over. And that would be enough. Not perfection, but relief. Not paradise, but the absence of a specific, grinding, ancient, purposeful evil that has been working to consume everything for 60 million years. Whether any of the threats discussed in this video succeed in producing that outcome is a question the lore has not answered, and may never answer definitively. That is appropriate. The question should stay open. Open questions are where imagination lives, and imagination is what has made this setting the endlessly generative, creative environment it has been for decades. But the fact that the question is genuinely open, that the outcome is genuinely uncertain, that the Chaos Gods face threats they cannot simply overpower and overcome by the usual means, is itself meaningful. It says something about what the setting believes about the nature of evil and the nature of hope, and whether consciousness, in the end, contains the seeds of its own liberation. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But some of those wars are being won. Final notes. The scale of what we are talking about. There is one more dimension of this subject that deserves attention before closing, and it is the simplest one, the scale. When you talk about the Chaos Gods being afraid, you are talking about entities whose power is measured in the emotional output of billions of sentient beings across thousands of worlds over millions of years. Their perception spans dimensions. Their reach extends across the entirety of the Milky Way. When they act, they do so through proxies and servants, who themselves operate at scales that dwarf any individual human comprehension. A bloodthirster, one of Khorne's greatest servants, can level a city block with a single blow. A greater unclean one is a walking pestilence that can kill a world's ecosystem with its passage. A Lord of Change moves the strings of political events across dozens of star systems simultaneously. These are the servants. The gods themselves are incomparably larger than anything their servants represent, and yet the things that threaten them are, in their own ways, similarly vast. The Necron Pylon network, when complete, will span the galaxy. The Tyranid hive mind connects billions of organisms across light years of space. Ennead draws power from the accumulated deaths of an entire species across 10,000 years. The Emperor has been fighting his war for 10,000 years without pause, burning 10 million psychers in that time, sustained by the faith of uncountable trillions. The Orks number in the billions across the galaxy. Their gestalt psychic field, a permanent background, hum in the Imperium that has never weakened, never faltered, never needed maintenance. When we talk about cosmic threats, we are talking about things that operate at these scales. And the fact that the Chaos Gods, operating at the scales they operate at, are genuinely threatened by these forces tells you how significant those forces actually are. The standards of power in this setting are not human standards. They are not even conventional sci-fi standards. They are something else entirely, a cosmology of entities whose conflicts are measured in geological time and galactic geography. The fact that individual mortals, individual space marines, and Imperial Guard soldiers and Eldari warriors and Ork boys exist and matter in the context of these cosmic forces is one of the most remarkable things about the setting. The stories at the human scale connect to the stories at the cosmic scale in ways that make both scales more meaningful. The Space Marine who dies defending a world from demonic incursion is, in some small way, contributing to the same story as the Silent King rebuilding the Blackstone network. The Eldari Farseer, who safely stores her soul stone, is contributing in her individual death to the growth of Yniad. The Psyker who gives their life on Terra is sustaining the Emperor's war against the warp. These connections exist. They are real within the setting's logic. And they mean that even in the most hopeless, most grinding, most individual scale corner of the 40K universe, the work that is done matters. Not in the sense that any individual victory will end the war, but in the sense that the cumulative weight of everything that is done, across all scales, determines what eventually happens at the cosmic level. The Chaos Gods are afraid of the cumulative weight. They are afraid of what happens when all those individual small resistances and strategic countermoves and structural threats add up to something that exceeds their ability to absorb. That is what this video has been about. Not the dramatic single confrontation, the great battle where a hero defeats a god. The structural, long-term, accumulated pressure of forces that do not fight chaos on its own terms, but change the terms of the conflict entirely. Whether those forces succeed is the question the 41st millennium has not yet answered, but it is asking it, very loudly, in the only language the Chaos Gods understand: force, time, and the stubborn persistence of things that refuse to simply be consumed. Thank you for this, genuinely. This has been one of the more rewarding lore subjects to dig into. If you are watching this for the first time, welcome. If you have been here before, welcome back. Either way, drop a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is, and what you think the ultimate fate of the Chaos Gods will be. I am genuinely curious where people land on that question. Subscribe if this kind of deep cosmological dive is your thing. There is more of it. There is always more of it in this setting, and I want to explore all of it with you. The grim darkness of the far future awaits.